Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 11. Outside the barracks. Snow. A meeting. For dreariness nothing could surpass a prospect in the outskirts of a certain town and military station, many miles north of Weatherbury, at a later hour on this same snowy evening, if that may be called a prospect of which the chief constituent was darkness. It was a night when sorrow may come to the brightest without causing any great sense of incongruity, when with impressible persons love becomes solicitousness, hope sinks to misgiving, and faith to hope, when the exercise of memory does not stir feelings of regret at opportunities for ambition that have been passed by, and anticipation does not prompt to enterprise. The scene was a public path, bordered on the left hand by a river, behind which rose a high wall. On the right was a tract of land, partly meadow and partly moor, reaching, at its remote verge, to a wide undulating upland. The changes of the seasons are less obtrusive on spots of this kind than amid woodland scenery. Still, to a close observer, they are just as perceptible. The difference is that their media of manifestation are less trite and familiar than such well-known ones as the bursting of the bud or the fall of the leaf. Many are not so stealthy and gradual as we may be apt to imagine in considering the general torpidity of a moor or waste. Winter, in coming to the country hereabout, advanced in well-marked stages, wherein might have been successfully observed the retreat of the snakes, the transformation of the ferns, the filling of the pools, a rising of fogs, the embrowning by frost, the collapse of the fungi, and an obliteration by snow. This climax of the series had been reached tonight on the aforesaid moor, and for the first time in the season its irregularities were forms without features, suggestive of anything, proclaiming nothing, and without more character than that of being the limit of something else, the lowest layer of a firmament of snow. From this chaotic skyful of crowding flakes, the mead and moor momentarily received additional clothing, only to appear momentarily more naked thereby. The vast arch of cloud above was strangely low, and it formed, as it were, the roof of a large dark cavern, gradually sinking in upon its floor, for the instinctive thought was that the snow lining the heavens and that encrusting the earth would soon unite into one mass without any intervening stratum of air at all. We turn our attention to the left-hand characteristics, which were flatness in respect of the river, verticality in respect of the wall behind it, and darkness as to both. These features made up the mass. If anything could be darker than the sky, it was the wall, and if anything could be gloomier than the wall, it was the river beneath. The indistinct summit of the façade was notched and pronged by chimneys here and there, and upon its face were faintly signified the oblong shapes of windows, though only in the upper part. Below, down to the water's edge, the flat was unbroken by hole or projection. An indescribable succession of dull blows, perplexing in their regularity, sent their sound with difficulty through the fluffy atmosphere. It was a neighbouring clock striking 10. The bell was in the open air, and being overlaid with several inches of muffling snow, had lost its voice for the time. About this hour the snow abated. 10 flakes fell where 20 had fallen. Then one had the room of 10. Not long after, a form moved by the brink of the river. By its outline upon the colourless background a close observer might have seen that it was small. This was all that was positively discoverable, though it seemed human. The shape went slowly along, but without much exertion, for the snow, though sudden, was not yet more than 2 inches deep. At this time some words were spoken aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Between each utterance the little shape advanced about half a dozen yards. It was evident now that the windows high in the wall were being counted. The word 5 represented a 5th window from the end of the wall. Here the spot stopped and dwindled smaller. The figure was stooping. Then a morsel of snow flew across the river towards the 5th window. It smacked against the wall at a point several yards from its mark. The throw was the idea of a man conjoined with the execution of a woman. No man who had ever seen a bird, rabbit, or squirrel in his childhood could possibly have thrown with such utter imbecility as was shown here. Another attempt, and another, till by degrees the wall must have become pimpled with the adhering lumps of snow. At last one fragment struck the 5th window. The river would have been seen by day to be of that deep, smooth sort which races middle and sides with the same gliding precision, any irregularities of speed being immediately corrected by a small whirlpool. Nothing was heard in reply to this signal but the gurgle and cluck of one of these invisible wheels, together with a few small sounds which a sad man would have called moans and a happy man laughter, caused by the flapping of the waters against trifling objects in other parts of the stream. The window was struck again in the same manner. Then a noise was heard, apparently produced by the opening of the window. This was followed by a voice from the same quarter. "Who's there?" The tones were masculine, and not those of surprise. The high wall being that of a barrack, and marriage being looked upon with disfavour by the army, assignations and communications had probably been made across the river before tonight. "Is it Sergeant Troy?" said the blurred spot in the snow, tremulously. This person was so much like a mere shade upon the earth, and the other speaker so much a part of the building, that one would have said the wall was holding a conversation with the snow. "Yes," came suspiciously from the shadow. "What girl are you?" "Oh, Frank, don't you know me?" said the spot. "Your wife, Fanny Robin." "Fanny?" said the wall, in utter astonishment. "Yes," said the girl, with a half-suppressed gasp of emotion. There was something in the woman's tone which was not that of the wife, and there was a manner in the man which was rarely a husband's. The dialogue went on. "How did you come here?" "I asked which was your window. Forgive me." "I did not expect you tonight. Indeed, I did not think you would come at all. It was a wonder you found me here. I am orderly tomorrow." "You said I was to come." "Well, I said you might." "Yes, I mean that I might. You are glad to see me, Frank?" "Oh, yes, of course."
Can you come to me?"
"My dear Fan, no. The bugle has sounded. The barrack gates are closed, and I have no leave. We are all of us as good as in the county gaol till tomorrow morning."
"Then I shan't see you till then."
The words were in a faltering tone of disappointment. "How did you get here from Weatherbury?"
"I walked. Some part of the way, the rest by the carriers."
"I am surprised."
"Yes, so am I. And Frank, when will it be?"
"What?"
"That you promised."
"I don't quite recollect."
"Oh, you do. Don't speak like that. It weighs me to the earth. It makes me say what ought to be said first by you."
"Never mind, say it."
"Oh, must I? It is, when shall we be married, Frank?"
"Oh, I see. Well, you have to get proper clothes."
"I have money. Will it be by banns or licence?"
"Banns, I should think."
"And we live in two parishes."
"Do we? What then?"
"My lodgings are in St. Mary's, and this is not, so they will have to be published in both."
"Is that the law?"
"Yes. Oh, Frank, you think me forward, I'm afraid. Don't, dear Frank, will you? For I love you so. And you said lots of times you would marry me, and I.
"Don't cry now. It is foolish. If I said so, of course I will."
And shall I put up the banns in my parish, and will you in yours?"
"Yes."
"Tomorrow?"
"Not tomorrow. We'll settle in a few days."
"You have the permission of the officers?"
"No, not yet."
"Oh, how is that? You said you almost had before you left Casterbridge."
"The fact is, I forgot to ask. Your coming like this is so sudden and unexpected."
"Yes, yes, it is. It was wrong of me to worry you. I'll go away now. Will you come and see me tomorrow at Mrs. Twillis's in North Street? I don't like to come to the barracks. There are bad women about, and they think me one."
"Quite so. I'll come to you, my dear. Good night."
"Good night, Frank. Good night."
And the noise was again heard of a window closing. The little spot moved away. When she passed the corner, a subdued exclamation was heard inside the wall. "Ho, ho, Sergeant! Ho, ho!" An expostulation followed, but it was indistinct, and it became lost amid a low peal of laughter, which was hardly distinguishable from the gurgle of the tiny whirlpools outside. End of chapter 11. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, chapter 12. Farmers, a rule, an exception. The first public evidence of Bathsheba's decision to be a farmer in her own person and by proxy no more, was her appearance the following market day in the corn market at Casterbridge. The low though extensive hall, supported by beams and pillars, and latterly dignified by the name of Corn Exchange, was thronged with hot men who talked among each other in twos and threes, the speaker of the minute looking sideways into his auditor's face and concentrating his argument by a contraction of one eyelid during delivery. The greater number carried in their hands ground ash saplings, using them partly as walking sticks, and partly for poking up pigs, sheep, neighbours with their backs turned, and restful things in general, which seemed to require such treatment in the course of their peregrinations. During conversations, each subjected his sapling to great varieties of usage, bending it around his neck, forming an arch of it between his two hands, overweighting it on the ground till it reached nearly a semicircle, or perhaps it was hastily tucked under the arm whilst the sample bag was pulled forth, and a handful of corn poured into the palm, which, after criticism, was flung upon the floor, an issue of events perfectly well known to half a dozen acute town-bred fowls, which had, as usual, crept into the building unobserved, and waited the fulfilment of their anticipations with a high-stretched neck and oblique eye. Among these heavy yeomen a feminine figure glided, the single one of her sex that the room contained. She was prettily and even daintily dressed. She moved between them as a chaise between carts, was heard after them as a romance after sermons, was felt among them like a breeze among furnaces. It had required a little determination, far more than she had at first imagined, to take up a position here, for at her first entry the lumbering dialogues had ceased, nearly every face had been turned towards her, and those that were already turned rigidly fixed there. 2 or 3 only of the farmers were personally known to Bathsheba, and to these she had made her way. But if she was to be the practical woman she had intended to show herself, business must be carried on, introductions or none, and she ultimately acquired confidence enough to speak and reply boldly to men merely known to her by hearsay. Bathsheba, too, had her sample bag, and by degrees adopted a professional pour into the hand, holding up the grains in her narrow palm for inspection in perfect Casterbridge manner. Something in the exact arch of the upper unbroken row of teeth, and in the keenly pointed corners of her red mouth when, with parted lips, she somewhat defiantly turned up her face to argue a point with a tall man, suggested that there was potentiality enough in that lithe slip of humanity for alarming exploits of sex, and daring enough to carry them out. But her eyes had a softness, invariably a softness, which, had they not been dark, would have seemed mistiness. As they were, it lowered an expression that might have been piercing to simple clearness. Strange to say of a woman in full bloom and vigour, she always allowed her interlocutors to finish their statements before rejoining with hers. In arguing on prices she held to her own firmly, as was natural in a dealer, and reduced theirs persistently, as was inevitable in a woman. But there was an elasticity in her firmness which removed it from obstinacy, as there was a naivety in her cheapening which saved it from meanness. Those of the farmers with whom she had no dealings, by far the greater part, were continually asking each other, "Who is she?" The reply would be, "Farmer Everdene's niece. Took on Weatherbury Upper Farm, turned away the bailey, and swears she'll do everything herself." The other man would then shake his head. "Yes, 'tis a pity she's so headstrong," the first would say. "But we ought to be proud of her here. She lightens up the old place. 'Tis such a shapely maid, however, that she'll soon get picked up." It would be ungallant to suggest that the novelty of her engagement in such an occupation had almost as much to do with the magnetism as had the beauty of her face and movements. However, the interest was general, and this Saturday's debut in the Forum, whatever it may have been to Bathsheba as the buying and selling farmer, was unquestionably a triumph to her as the maiden. Indeed, the sensation was so pronounced that her instinct on 2 or 3 occasions was merely to walk as a queen among these gods of the fallow, like a little sister of a little Jove, and to neglect closing prices altogether. The numerous evidences of her power to attract were only thrown into greater relief by a marked exception. Women seem to have eyes in their ribbons for such matters as these. Bathsheba, without looking within a right angle of him, was conscious of a black sheep among the flock. It perplexed her first. If there had been a respectable minority on either side, the case would have been almost natural. If nobody had regarded her, she would have taken the matter indifferently, if such cases had occurred. If everybody, this man included, she would have taken it as a matter of course. People had done so before. But the smallness of the exception made the mystery. She soon knew thus much of the recusant's appearance. He was a gentlemanly man, with full and distinctly outlined Roman features, the prominences of which glowed in the sun with a bronze-like richness of tone. He was erect in attitude, and quiet in demeanour. One characteristic preeminently marked him: dignity. Apparently he had some time ago reached that entrance to middle age at which a man's aspect naturally ceases to alter for the term of a dozen years or so, and artificially a woman's does likewise. 35 and 50 were his limits of variation. He might have been either, or anywhere between the two. It may be said that married men of 40 are usually ready and generous enough to fling passing glances at any specimen of moderate beauty they may discern by the way. Probably, as with persons playing whist for love, the consciousness of a certain immunity under any circumstances from that worst possible ultimate, the having to pay, makes them unduly speculative. Bathsheba was convinced that this unmoved person was not a married man. When marketing was over, she rushed off to Liddy, who was waiting for her beside the yellow gig in which they had driven to town. The horse was put in, and on they trotted, Bathsheba's sugar, tea, and drapery parcels being packed behind, and expressing in some indescribable manner, by their colour, shape, and general lineaments, that they were the young lady farmer's property, and the grocer's and draper's no more. "I've been through it, Liddy, and it's over. I shan't mind it again, for they will all have grown accustomed to seeing me there. But this morning it was as bad as being married. Eyes everywhere." "I knowed it would be," said Liddy. "Men be such a terrible class of society to look at a body." "But there was one man who had more sense than to waste his time upon me." The information was put in this form that Liddy might not for a moment suppose her mistress to be at all piqued. "A very good-looking man," she continued. "Upright, about 40, I should think. Do you know at all who he could be?" Liddy could not think. "Can't you guess at all?" said Bathsheba with some disappointment. "I haven't a notion. Besides, 'tis no difference, since he took less notice of you than any of the rest. Now, if he'd taken more, it would have mattered a great deal." Bathsheba was suffering from the reverse feeling just then, and they bowled along in silence. A low carriage bowling along still more rapidly behind a horse of unimpeachable breed overtook and passed them. "Why, there he is," she said. Liddy looked. "That's Farmer Boldwood. Of course it is. The man you couldn't see the other day when he called." "Oh, Farmer Boldwood," murmured Bathsheba, and looked at him as he outstripped them. The farmer had never turned his head once, but with eyes fixed on the most advanced point along the road, passed as unconsciously and abstractedly as if Bathsheba and her charms were thin air. "He's an interesting man, don't you think so?" she remarked. "Oh yes, very. Everybody owns it," replied Liddy. "I wonder why he's so wrapped up and indifferent, and seemingly so far away from all he sees around him. It is said, but not known for certain, that he met with some bitter disappointment when he was a young man and merry. A woman jilted him, they say." "People always say that, and we know very well women scarcely ever jilt men. 'Tis the men who jilt us. I expect it is simply his nature to be so reserved." "Simply his nature. I expect so, miss. Nothing else in the world." "Still, 'tis more romantic to think he has been served cruelly, poor thing. Perhaps after all he has." "Oh, depend upon it, he has. Oh yes, miss, he has. I feel he must have." "However, we are very apt to think extremes of people. I shouldn't wonder, after all, if it wasn't a little of both, just between the two. Rather cruelly used, and rather reserved." "Oh dear no, miss. I can't think it between the two." "That is most likely." "Well, yes, so it is. I am convinced it is most likely. You may take my word, miss, that that's what's the matter with him." End of chapter 12. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, chapter 13. Sortes Sanctorum, The Valentine. It was Sunday afternoon in the farmhouse on the 13th of February. Dinner being over, Bathsheba, for want of a better companion, had asked Liddy to come and sit with her. The mouldy pile was dreary in winter time before the candles were lighted and the shutters closed. The atmosphere of the place seemed as old as the walls. Every nook behind the furniture had a temperature of its own, for the fire was not kindled in this part of the house early in the day, and Bathsheba's new piano, which was an old one in other annals, looked particularly sloping and out of level on the warped floor, before night threw a shade over its less prominent angles and hid the unpleasantness. Liddy, like a little brook, though shallow, was always rippling. Her presence had not so much weight as to task thought, and yet enough to exercise it. On the table lay an old quarto Bible bound in leather. Liddy, looking at it, said, "Did you ever find out, miss, who you were going to marry by means of the Bible and key?" "Don't be so foolish, Liddy, as if such things could be." "Well, there's a good deal in it all the same." "Nonsense, child." "And it makes your heart beat fearful. Some believe in it, some don't. I do." "Very well, let's try it," said Bathsheba, bounding from her seat with a total disregard of consistency which can be indulged in towards a dependent, and entering into the spirit of divination at once. "Go and get the front door key." Liddy fetched it. "I wish it wasn't Sunday," she said on returning. "Perhaps 'tis wrong." "What's right weekdays is right Sundays," replied her mistress in a tone which was a proof in itself. The book was opened, the leaves, drab with age, being quite worn away at much read verses by the forefingers of unpractised readers in former days, where they were moved along under the line as an aid to the vision. The special verse in the Book of Ruth was sought out by Bathsheba, and the sublime words met her eye. They slightly thrilled and abashed her. It was wisdom in the abstract facing folly in the concrete. Folly in the concrete blushed, persisted in her intention, and placed the key on the book. A rusty patch immediately upon the verse, caused by previous pressure of an iron substance thereon, told that this was not the first time the old volume had been used for the purpose. "Now keep steady and be silent," said Bathsheba. The verse was repeated. The book turned round. Bathsheba blushed guiltily. "Who did you try?" said Liddy curiously. "I shall not tell you." "Did you notice Mr. Boldwood's doing in church this morning, miss?" Liddy continued, adumbrating by the remark the track her thoughts had taken. "No, indeed," said Bathsheba with serene indifference. "His pew is exactly opposite yours, miss." "I know it." "And you did not see his goings-on?" "Certainly I did not, I tell you." Liddy assumed a smaller physiognomy, and shut her lips decisively. This move was unexpected and proportionately disconcerting. "What did he do?" Bathsheba said perforce. "Didn't turn his head to look at you once all the service." "Why should he?" again demanded her mistress, wearing a nettled look. "I didn't ask him to." "Oh, no, but everybody else was noticing you, and it was odd he didn't. There, 'tis like him, rich and gentlemanly. What does he care?" Bathsheba dropped into a silence intended to express that she had opinions on the matter too abstruse for Liddy's comprehension, rather than that she had nothing to say. "Dear me, I had nearly forgotten the valentine I bought yesterday," she exclaimed at length. "Valentine? For who, miss?" said Liddy. "Farmer Boldwood?" It was a single name among all possible wrong ones that just at this moment seemed to Bathsheba more pertinent than the right. "Well, no. It's only for little Teddy Coggan. I have promised him something, and this will be a pretty surprise for him. Liddy, you may as well bring me my desk, and I'll direct it at once." Bathsheba took from her desk a gorgeously illuminated and embossed design in post octavo, which had been bought on the previous market day at the chief stationer's in Casterbridge. In the centre was a small oval enclosure. This was left blank, that the sender might insert tender words more appropriate to the special occasion than any generalities by a printer could possibly be. "Here's a place for writing," said Bathsheba. "What shall I put?" "Something of this sort, I should think," returned Liddy promptly. "The rose is red, the violet's blue, carnation sweet, and so are you." "Yes, that shall be it.
"It just suits itself to a chubby-faced child like him," said Bathsheba. She inserted the words in a small though legible handwriting, enclosed the sheet in an envelope, and dipped her pen for the direction. "What fun it would be to send it to the stupid old Boldwood, and how he would wonder!" said the irrepressible Liddy, lifting her eyebrows, and indulging in an awful mirth on the verge of fear as she thought of the moral and social magnitude of the man contemplated. Bathsheba paused to regard the idea at full length. Boldwood's had begun to be a troublesome image, a species of Daniel in her kingdom, who persisted in kneeling eastward when reason and common sense said that he might just as well follow suit with the rest and afford her the official glance of admiration which cost nothing at all. She was far from being seriously concerned about his nonconformity. Still, it was faintly depressing that the most dignified and valuable man in the parish should withhold his eyes, and that a girl like Liddy should talk about it. So Liddy's idea was at first rather harassing than pique one. "No, I won't do that. He wouldn't see any humour in it." "He'd worry to death," said the persistent Liddy. "Really, I don't care particularly to send it to Teddy," remarked her mistress. "He's rather a naughty child sometimes." "Yes, that he is." "Let's toss, as men do," said Bathsheba idly. "Now then, head, Boldwood, tail, Teddy. No, we won't toss money on a Sunday. That would be tempting the devil indeed." "Toss this hymn book. There can be no sinfulness in that, miss." "Very well. Open Boldwood, shut Teddy. No, it's more likely to fall open. Open Teddy, shut Boldwood." The book went fluttering in the air and came down shut. Bathsheba, a small yawn upon her mouth, took the pen, and with off-hand serenity directed the missive to Boldwood. "Now light a candle, Liddy. Which seal shall we use? Here's a unicorn's head. There's nothing in that. What's this? Two doves? No. It ought to be something extraordinary, ought it not, Liddy? Here's one with a motto. I remember it is some funny one, but I can't read it. We'll try this, and if it doesn't do, we'll have another." A large red seal was duly affixed. Bathsheba looked closely at the hot wax to discover the words. "Capital!" she exclaimed, throwing down the letter frolicsomely. "'Twould upset the solemnity of a parson and clerk too." Liddy looked at the words of the seal and read, "Marry me." The same evening the letter was sent, and was duly sorted in Casterbridge post office that night, to be returned to Weatherbury again in the morning. So very idly and unreflectingly was this deed done. Of love as a spectacle Bathsheba had a fair knowledge, but of love subjectively she knew nothing. End of chapter 13. Far from the Madding Crowd, by Thomas Hardy, chapter 14. Effect of the letter. Sunrise. At dusk on the evening of St. Valentine's Day, Boldwood sat down to supper as usual by a beaming fire of aged logs. Upon the mantel-shelf before him was a timepiece surmounted by a spread eagle, and upon the eagle's wings was the letter Bathsheba had sent. Here the bachelor's gaze was continually fastening itself, till the large red seal became as a blot of blood on the retina of his eye, and as he ate and drank he still read in fancy the words thereon, although they were too remote for his sight. "Marry me." The pert injunction was like those crystal substances which, colourless themselves, assumed the tone of objects about them. Here in the quiet of Boldwood's parlour, where everything that was not grave was extraneous, and where the atmosphere was that of a Puritan Sunday lasting all the week, the letter and its dictum changed their tenor from the thoughtlessness of their origin to a deep solemnity imbibed from their accessories now. Since the receipt of the missive in the morning, Boldwood had felt the symmetry of his existence to be slowly getting distorted in the direction of an ideal passion. The disturbance was as the first floating weed to Columbus, the contemptibility little suggesting possibilities of the infinitely great. The letter must have had an origin and a motive. That the latter was of the smallest magnitude compatible with his existence at all, Boldwood of course did not know, and such an explanation did not strike him as a possibility even. It is foreign to a mystified condition of mind to realize of the mystifier that the processes of approving a course suggested by circumstance,
and of striking out a course from inner impulse would look the same in the result. The vast difference between starting a train of events and directing into a particular groove a series already started is rarely apparent to the person confounded by the issue. When Boldwood went to bed he placed the valentine in the corner of the looking-glass. He was conscious of its presence even when his back was turned upon it. It was the first time in Boldwood's life that such an event had occurred. The same fascination that had caused him to think it an act which had a deliberate motive prevented him from regarding it as an impertinence. He looked again at the direction. The mysterious influences of night invested the writing with the presence of the unknown writer. Somebody's, some woman's hand had travelled softly over the paper bearing his name. Her unrevealed eyes had watched every curve as she formed it. Her brain had seen him in imagination the while. Why should she have imagined him? Her mouth, were her lips pale or red, plump or creased, had curved itself to a certain expression as the pen went on. The corners had moved with all their natural tremulousness. What had been the expression? The vision of the woman writing as a supplement to the words written had no individuality. She was a misty shape, and well she might be, considering that her original was at that moment sound asleep, and oblivious of all love and letter-writing under the sky. Whenever Boldwood dozed she took a form, and comparatively ceased to be a vision. When he awoke, there was a letter justifying the dream. The moon shone tonight, and its light was not of a customary kind. His window emitted only a reflection of its rays, and the pale sheen had that reversed direction which snow gives, coming upward and lighting up his ceiling in an unnatural way, casting shadows in strange places and putting lights where shadows had used to be. The substance of the epistle had occupied him but little in comparison with the fact of its arrival. He suddenly wondered if anything more might be found in the envelope than what he had withdrawn. He jumped out of bed in the weird light, took the letter, pulled out the flimsy sheet, shook the envelope, and searched it. Nothing more was there. Boldwood looked, as he had 100 times the preceding day, at the insistent red seal. "Marry me," he said aloud. The solemn and reserved yeoman again closed the letter, and stuck it in the frame of the glass. In doing so he caught sight of his reflected features, wan in expression and insubstantial in form. He saw how closely compressed was his mouth, and that his eyes were widespread and vacant. Feeling uneasy and dissatisfied with himself for this nervous excitability, he returned to bed. Then the dawn drew on. The full power of the clear heaven was not equal to that of a cloudy sky at noon, when Boldwood arose and dressed himself. He descended the stairs and went out towards the gate of a field to the east, leaning over which he paused and looked around. It was one of the usual slow sunrises of this time of year, and the sky, pure violet in the zenith, was leaden to the northward and murky to the east, where over the snowy down or ewe-lease on Weatherbury Upper Farm, and apparently resting upon the ridge, the only half of the sun yet visible burnt rayless, like a red and flameless fire shining over a white hearthstone. The whole effect resembled a sunset as childhood resembles age. In other directions the fields and sky were so much of one colour by the snow that it was difficult in a hasty glance to tell whereabouts the horizon occurred, and in general there was here too that before-mentioned preternatural inversion of light and shade which attends the prospect when the garish brightness commonly in the sky is found on the earth, and the shades of the earth are in the sky. Over the west hung the wasting moon, now dull and greenish yellow like tarnished brass. Boldwood was listlessly noting how the frost had hardened and glazed the surface of the snow till it shone in the red eastern light with the polish of marble, how in some portions of the slope withered grass bents, encased in icicles, bristled through the smooth wan coverlet in the twisted and curved shapes of old Venetian glass, and how the footprints of a few birds, which had hopped over the snow whilst it lay in the state of a soft fleece, were now frozen to a short permanency. A half-muffled noise of light wheels interrupted him. Boldwood turned back to the road. It was the mail cart, a crazy two-wheeled vehicle, hardly heavy enough to resist a puff of wind. The driver held out a letter. Boldwood seized it and opened it, expecting another anonymous one.
So greatly are people's ideas of probability a mere sense that precedent will repeat itself.
"I don't think it's for you, sir," said the man when he saw Boldwood's action. "Though there's no name on it, I think it's for your shepherd." Boldwood looked then at the address. To the new shepherd, Weatherbury Farm, near Casterbridge. "Oh, what a mistake! It is not mine, nor is it for my shepherd. It is for Miss Everdene's. You had better take it on to him, Gabriel Oak, and say I opened it in mistake." At this moment, on the ridge, up against the blazing sky, a figure was visible, like the black snuff in the midst of a candle flame. Then it moved and began to bustle about vigorously from place to place, carrying square skeleton masses, which were riddled by the same rays. A small figure on all fours followed behind. The tall form was that of Gabriel Oak, the small one that of George. The articles in course of transit were hurdles. "Wait," said Boldwood. "That's the man on the hill. I'll take the letter to him myself." To Boldwood it was now no longer merely a letter to another man. It was an opportunity. Exhibiting a face pregnant with intention, he entered the snowy field. Gabriel at that minute descended the hill towards the right. The glow stretched down in this direction and touched the distant roof of Warren's malt-house, whither the shepherd was apparently bent. Boldwood followed at a distance. End of chapter 14. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 15. A morning meeting. The letter again. The scarlet and orange light outside the malt-house did not penetrate to its interior, which was, as usual, lighted by a rival glow of similar hue, radiating from the hearth. The maltster, having lain down in his clothes for a few hours, was now sitting beside a three-legged table, breakfasting off bread and bacon. This was eaten on the plateless system, which is performed by placing a slice of bread upon the table, the meat flat upon the bread, a mustard plaster upon the meat, and a pinch of salt upon the whole, then cutting them vertically downwards with a large pocket-knife till wood is reached, when the severed lump is impaled on the knife, elevated, and sent the proper way of food. The maltster's lack of teeth appeared not to sensibly diminish his powers at a mill. He had been without them for so many years that toothlessness was felt less to be a defect than hard gums an acquisition. Indeed, he seemed to approach the grave as a hyperbolic curve approaches a straight line, less directly as he got nearer, till it was doubtful if he would ever reach it at all. In the ash-pit was a heap of potatoes roasting, and a boiling pipkin of charred bread, called coffee for the benefit of whomsoever should call, for Warren's was a sort of club-house, used as an alternative to the inn. "I says I, we get a fine day, and then down comes a snapper at night," was a remark now suddenly heard spreading into the malt-house from the door, which had been opened the previous moment. The form of Henery Fray advanced to the fire, stamping the snow from his boots when about half-way there. The speech and entry had not seemed to be at all an abrupt beginning to the maltster, introductory matter often being omitted in this neighbourhood, both from word and deed, and the maltster, having the same latitude allowed him, did not hurry to reply. He picked up a fragment of cheese by pecking upon it with his knife, as a butcher picks up skewers. Henery appeared in a drab kerseymere greatcoat, buttoned over his smock-frock, the white skirts of the latter being visible to the distance of about a foot below the coat-tails, which, when you got used to the style of dress, looked natural enough, and even ornamental. It certainly was comfortable. Matthew Moon, Joseph Poorgrass, and other carters and waggoners followed at his heels, with great lanterns dangling from their hands, which showed that they had just come from the cart-horse stables, where they had been busily engaged since 4 o'clock that morning. "And how's she getting on without a baily?" the maltster inquired. Henery shook his head, and smiled one of those bitter smiles, dragging all the flesh of his forehead into a corrugated heap in the centre. "She'll rue it, surely, surely," he said. "Benjy Pennyways were not a true man or honest baily, as big a betrayer as Judas Iscariot himself. But to think she can carry on alone." He allowed his head to swing laterally 3 or 4 times in silence. "Never in all my creeping up, never." This was recognized by all as the conclusion of some gloomy speech which had been expressed in thought alone during the shake of the head. Henery, meanwhile, retained several marks of despair upon his face, to imply that they would be required for use again directly he should go on speaking. "All'll be ruined, and ourselves too, or there's no mating gentlemen's houses," said Mark Clark. "A headstrong maid, that's what she is, and won't listen to no advice at all. Pride and vanity have ruined many a cobbler's dog. Dear, dear, when I think o't, I sorrows like a man in travel." "True, Henery, you do. I've heard ye," said Joseph Poorgrass in a voice of thorough attestation, and with a wire-drawn smile of misery. "'Twould do a mortal man no harm to have us under a bonnet," said Billy Smallbury, who had just entered, bearing his one tooth before him. "She can speak real language, and must have some sense somewhere. Do you follow me?" "I do, but no baily. I deserve that place," wailed Henery, signifying wasted genius by gazing blankly at visions of a high destiny apparently visible to him on Billy Smallbury's smock frock. "There, 'twas to be, I suppose. Your lot is your lot, and Scripture is nothing. For if you do good, you don't get rewarded according to your works, but be cheated in some mean way out of your recompense." "No, no, I don't agree with 'ee there," said Mark Clark. "God's a perfect gentleman in that respect." "Good works, good pay, so to speak it," attested Joseph Poorgrass. A short pause ensued, and, as a sort of entr'acte, Henery turned and blew out the lanterns, which the increase of daylight rendered no longer necessary even in the malt-house with its one pane of glass. "I wonder what a farmer woman can want with a harpsichord, dulcimer, piano, or whatever 'tis they call it," said the maltster. "Liddy saith she've a new one." "Got a pianner?" "Ah, seems her old uncle's things were not good enough for her. She've bought all but everything new. There's heavy chairs for the stout, weak and wiry ones for the slender, great watches getting on to the size of clocks to stand upon the chimbley piece. Pictures, for the most part wonderful frames. And long horsehair settles for the drunk, with horsehair pillows at each end," said Mr. Clark. "Likewise looking glasses for the pretty, and lion books for the wicked." A firm loud tread was now heard stamping outside. The door was opened about 6 inches, and somebody on the other side exclaimed, "Neighbours, have we got room for a few newborn lambs?" "Ah, sure, shepherd," said the conclave. The door was flung back till it kicked the wall and trembled from top to bottom with the blow. Mr. Oak appeared in the entry, with a steaming face, hay bands round about his ankles to keep out the snow, a leather strap round his waist outside the smock frock, and looking altogether an epitome of the world's health and vigour. 4 lambs hung in various embarrassing attitudes over his shoulders, and the dog George, whom Gabriel had contrived to fetch from Norcombe, stalked solemnly behind. "Well, Shepherd Oak, and how's lambing this year, if I mid say it?" inquired Joseph Poorgrass. "Terrible trying," said Oak. "I've been wet through twice a day, either in snow or rain, this last fortnight. Cainy and I haven't tined our eyes tonight." "A good few twins too, I hear." "Too many by half. Yes, 'tis very queer lambing this year. We shan't be done by Lady Day." "And last year 'twere all over by Sexajessamine Sunday," Joseph remarked. "Bring on the rest, Cain," said Gabriel, "and then run back to the ewes. I'll follow you soon." Cainy Ball, a cheery-faced young lad with a small circular orifice by way of mouth, advanced and deposited 2 others, and retired as he was bidden. Oak lowered the lambs from their unnatural elevation, wrapped them in hay, and placed them round the fire. "We've no lambing hut here as I used to have at Norcombe," said Gabriel, "and 'tis such a plague to bring the weakly ones to a house. If it wasn't for your place here, Malter, I don't know what I should do with this keen weather. And how is it with you to-day, Malter?" "Ah, neither sick nor sorry, shepherd, but no younger." "Ay, I understand." "Sit down, Shepherd Oak," continued the ancient man of malt. "And how was the old place at Norcombe when you went for your dog? I should like to see the old familiar spot. But faith, I shouldn't know a soul there now." "I suppose you wouldn't. 'Tis altered very much." "Is it true that Dicky Hill's wooden cider house is pulled down?" "Oh, yes, years ago, and Dicky's cottage just above it." "Well, to be sure." "Yes,
And Tompkins's old apple tree is rooted, that used to bear 2 hogsheads of cider, and no help from other trees. Rooted? You don't say it. Stirring times we live in, stirring times. And you can mind that old well that used to be in the middle of the place. That's turned into a solid iron pump with a large stone trough and all complete. Dear, dear, how the face of nations alter, and what we live to see nowadays. Yes, 'tis the same here. They've been talking but now of the missus's strange doings." "What have you been saying about her?" inquired Oak, sharply, turning to the rest, and getting very warm. "These middle-aged men have been pulling her over the coals for pride and vanity," said Mark Clark. "But I say, let her have rope enough. Bless her pretty face, shouldn't I like to do so, upon her cherry lips?" The gallant Mark Clark here made a peculiar and well-known sound with his own. "Mark," said Gabriel sternly, "now you mind this. None of that dalliance talk, that smack and coddle style of yours about Miss Everdene. I don't allow it, do you hear?" "With all my heart, I've no chance," replied Mr. Clark cordially. "I suppose you've been speaking against her?" said Oak, turning to Joseph Poorgrass with a very grim look. "No, no, not a word. 'Tis a real joyful thing that she's no worse, that's what I say," said Joseph, trembling and blushing with terror. "Matthew just said—" "Matthew Moon, what have you been saying?" asked Oak. "I? Well, you know I wouldn't harm a worm. No, not one underground worm," said Matthew Moon, looking very uneasy. "Well, somebody has. And look here, neighbours." Gabriel, though one of the quietest and most gentle men on earth, rose to the occasion with martial promptness and vigour. "That's my fist." Here he placed his fist, rather smaller in size than a common loaf, in the mathematical centre of the maltster's little table, and with it gave a bump or two thereon, as if to ensure that their eyes all thoroughly took in the idea of fistiness before he went further. "Now, the first man in the parish that I hear prophesying bad of our mistress, why—" Here the fist was raised and let fall as Thor might have done with his hammer in assaying it. "He'll smell and taste that, or I'm a Dutchman." All earnestly expressed by their features that their minds did not wander to Holland for a moment on account of this statement, but were deploring the difference which gave rise to the figure, and Mark Clark cried, "Hear, hear! Just what I should have said." The dog George looked up at the same time after the shepherd's menace, and though he understood English but imperfectly, began to growl. "Now don't you take on so, shepherd, and sit down," said Henery with a deprecating peacefulness equal to anything of the kind in Christianity. "We hear that ye be an extraordinary good and clever man, shepherd," said Joseph Poorgrass, with considerable anxiety from behind the maltster's bedstead, whither he had retired for safety. "'Tis a great thing to be clever, I'm sure," he added, making movements associated with states of mind rather than body. "We wish we were, don't we, neighbours?" "Ay, that we do, sure," said Matthew Moon with a small anxious laugh towards Oak, to show how very friendly disposed he was likewise. "Who's been telling you I'm clever?" said Oak. "'Tis blowed about from pillar to post quite common," said Matthew. "We hear that you can tell the time as well by the stars as we can by the sun and moon, shepherd." "Yes, I can do a little that way," said Gabriel, as a man of medium sentiments on the subject. "And that you can make sundials and prent folks' names upon their waggons almost like copper plate, with beautiful flourishes and great long tails. An excellent fine thing for you to be such a clever man, shepherd. Joseph Poorgrass used to print Farmer James Everdene's waggons before you came, and I could never mind which way to turn the J's and the E's. Could he, Joseph?" Joseph shook his head to express how absolute was the fact that he couldn't. "And so you used to do 'em the wrong way, like this, didn't you, Joseph?" Matthew marked on the dusty floor with his whip handle. The word James appears here with the J and the E printed backwards. "And how Farmer James 'ud cuss, and call 'ee a fool, wouldn't he, Joseph, when 'a seed his name looking so inside out like?" continued Matthew Moon with feeling. "Ah, 'a would," said Joseph meekly. "But, you see, I wasn't so much to blame, for them J's and E's be such trying sons of witches for the memory to mind whether they face backward or forward, and I always had such a forgetful memory too." 'Tis a very bad affliction for ye, being such a man of calamities in other ways." "Well, 'tis, but a happy Providence ordered that it should be no worse, and I may feel my thanks. As to shepherd there, I'm sure missus ought to have made 'ee her baily, such a fitting man for it as you be." "I don't mind owning that I expected it," said Oak, frankly. "Indeed, I hoped for the place. At the same time, Miss Everdene has a right to be her own baily if she chooses, and to keep me down to be a common shepherd only." Oak drew a slow breath, looked sadly into the bright ash pit, and seemed lost in thoughts not of the most hopeful hue. The genial warmth of the fire now began to stimulate the nearly lifeless lambs to bleat and move their limbs briskly upon the hay, and to recognize for the first time the fact that they were born. Their noise increased to a chorus of baas, upon which Oak pulled the milk can from before the fire, and taking a small teapot from the pocket of his smock frock, filled it with milk, and taught those of the helpless creatures which were not to be restored to their dams how to drink from the spout, a trick they acquired with astonishing aptitude. "And she don't even let you take the skins of the dead lambs, I hear," resumed Joseph Poorgrass, his eyes lingering on the operations of Oak with the necessary melancholy. "I don't have 'em," said Gabriel. "Ye be very badly used, shepherd," hazarded Joseph again, in the hope of getting Oak as an ally in lamentation after all. "I think she's took against thee, that I do." "Oh, no, not at all," replied Gabriel hastily, and a sigh escaped him, which the deprivation of lambskins could hardly have caused. Before any further remark had been added, a shade darkened the door, and Boldwood entered the malthouse, bestowing upon each a nod of a quality between friendliness and condescension. "Ah, Oak, I thought you were here," he said. "I met the mail cart 10 minutes ago, and a letter was put into my hand, which I opened without reading the address. I believe it's yours. You must excuse the accident, please." "Oh, yes, not a bit of difference, Mr. Boldwood, not a bit," said Gabriel readily. He had not a correspondent on earth, nor was there a possible letter coming to him whose contents the whole parish would not have been welcome to peruse. Oak stepped aside, and read the following in an unknown hand. "Dear friend, I do not know your name, but I think these few lines will reach you, which I wrote to thank you for your kindness to me the night I left Weatherbury in a reckless way. I also return the money I owe you, which you will excuse my not keeping as a gift. All has ended well, and I am happy to say I am going to be married to the young man who has courted me for some time, Sergeant Troy, of the 11th Dragoon Guards, now quartered in this town. He would, I know, object to my having received anything except as a loan, being a man of great respectability and high honour, indeed a nobleman by blood. I should be much obliged to you if you would keep the contents of this letter a secret for the present, dear friend. We mean to surprise Weatherbury by coming there soon as husband and wife, though I blush to state it to one nearly a stranger. The sergeant grew up in Weatherbury. Thanking you again for your kindness, I am your sincere well-wisher, Fanny Robin." "Have you read it, Mr. Boldwood?" said Gabriel. "If not, you had better do so. I know you are interested in Fanny Robin." Boldwood read the letter and looked grieved. "Fanny, poor Fanny! The end she is so confident of has not yet come. She should remember, and may never come. I see she gives no address." "What sort of man is this Sergeant Troy?" said Gabriel. "I'm afraid not one to build much hope upon in a case such as this," the farmer murmured, "though he's a clever fellow and up to everything. A slight romance attaches to him, too. His mother was a French governess, and it seems that a secret attachment existed between her and the late Lord Severn. She was married to a poor medical man, and soon after an infant was born, and while money was forthcoming all went on well. Unfortunately for her boy, his best friends died, and he got then a situation as second clerk at a lawyer's in Casterbridge. He stayed there for some time, and might have worked himself into a dignified position of some sort had he not indulged in the wild freak of enlisting. I have much doubt if ever little Fanny will surprise us in the way she mentions. Very much doubt. Silly girl, silly girl." The door was hurriedly burst open again, and in came running Cainy Ball out of breath, his mouth red and open like the bell of a penny trumpet, from which he coughed with noisy vigour and great distension of face. "Now, Cain Ball," said Oak sternly, Why will you run so fast and lose your breath so? I'm always telling you of it." "Oh, a puff of me breath went the wrong way, please, Mr. Oak, and made me cough." "Well, what have you come for?" "I've run to tell ye," said the junior shepherd, supporting his exhausted youthful frame against the doorpost, "that you must come directly. Two more ewes have twinned. That's what's the matter, Shepherd Oak." "Oh, that's it," said Oak, jumping up, and dismissing for the present his thoughts on poor Fanny. "You're a good boy to run and tell me, Cain, and you should smell a large plum pudding some day as a treat. But before you go, Cain, you bring the tar pot, and we'll mark this lot and have done with 'em." Oak took from his illimitable pockets a marking iron, dipped it into the pot, and imprinted on the buttocks of the infant sheep the initials of her he delighted to muse on, B.E., which signified to all the region round that henceforth the lambs belonged to Farmer Bathsheba Everdene and to no one else. "Now, Cainy, shoulder your two and off. Good morning, Mr. Boldwood." The shepherd lifted the 16 large legs and 4 small bodies he himself had brought, and vanished with them in the direction of the lambing field hard by, their frames being now in a sleek and hopeful state, pleasantly contrasting with their death's door plight of half an hour before. Boldwood followed him a little way up the field, hesitated, and turned back. He followed him again with the last resolve, annihilating return. On approaching the nook in which the fold was constructed, the farmer drew out his pocket-book, unfastened it, and allowed it to lie open on his hand. A letter was revealed, Bathsheba's. "I was going to ask you, Oak," he said, with unreal carelessness, "if you know whose writing this is." Oak glanced into the book, and replied instantly with a flushed face, "Miss Everdene's." Oak had coloured simply at the consciousness of sounding her name. He now felt a strangely distressing qualm from a new thought. The letter could of course be no other than anonymous, or the inquiry would not have been necessary. Boldwood mistook his confusion. Sensitive persons are always ready with their "Is it I?" in preference to objective reasoning. "The question was perfectly fair," he returned, and there was something incongruous in the serious earnestness with which he applied himself to an argument on a valentine. "You know it is always expected that privy inquiries will be made. That's where the fun lies." If the word fun had been torture, it could not have been uttered with a more constrained and restless countenance than was Boldwood's then. Soon parting from Gabriel, the lonely and reserved man returned to his house to breakfast, feeling twinges of shame and regret at having so far exposed his mood by those fevered questions to a stranger. He again placed the letter on the mantelpiece, and sat down to think of the circumstances attending it by the light of Gabriel's information. End of chapter 15. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 16. All Saints and All Souls. On a weekday morning a small congregation, consisting mainly of women and girls, rose from its knees in the mouldy nave of a church called All Saints, in the distant barrack town before mentioned, at the end of a service without a sermon. They were about to disperse when a smart footstep, entering the porch and coming up the central passage, arrested their attention. The step echoed with a ring unusual in a church. It was the clink of spurs. Everybody looked. A young cavalry soldier in a red uniform, with the 3 chevrons of a sergeant upon his sleeve, strode up the aisle with an embarrassment which was only the more marked by the intense vigour of his step, and by the determination upon his face to show none. A slight flush had mounted his cheek by the time he had run the gauntlet between these women, but passing on through the chancel arch, he never paused till he came close to the altar railing. Here for a moment he stood alone. The officiating curate, who had not yet doffed his surplice, perceived the newcomer and followed him to the communion space. He whispered to the soldier. Then he beckoned to the clerk, who in his turn whispered to an elderly woman, apparently his wife, and they also went up the chancel steps. "'Tis a wedding," murmured some of the women, brightening. "Let's wait." The majority again sat down. There was a creaking of machinery behind, and some of the young ones turned their heads.
From the interior face of the west wall of the tower projected a little canopy, with a quarter-jack and small bell beneath it, the automation being driven by the same clock machinery that struck the large bell in the tower. Between the tower and the church was a close screen, the door of which was kept shut during services, hiding this grotesque clockwork from sight. At present, however, the door was open, and the egress of the jack, the blows on the bell, and the mannikin's retreat into the nook again were visible to many, and audible throughout the church. The jack had struck 11:30. "Where's the woman?" whispered some of the spectators. The young sergeant stood still with the abnormal rigidity of the old pillars around. He faced the south-east, and was as silent as he was still. The silence grew to be a noticeable thing as the minutes went on, and nobody else appeared, and not a soul moved. The rattle of the quarter-jack again from its niche, its blows for three-quarters, its fussy retreat, were almost painfully abrupt, and caused many of the congregation to start palpably. "I wonder where the woman is," a voice whispered again. There began now that slight shifting of feet, that artificial coughing among several, which betrays a nervous suspense. At length there was a titter, but the soldier never moved. There he stood, his face to the south-east, upright as a column, his cap in his hand. The clock ticked on, the women threw off their nervousness, and titters and giggles became more frequent. Then came a dead silence. Everyone was waiting for the end. Some persons may have noticed how extraordinarily the striking of quarters seems to quicken the flight of time. It was hardly credible that the jack had not got wrong with the minutes when the rattle began again, the puppet emerged, and the 4 quarters were struck fitfully as before. One could almost be positive that there was a malicious leer upon the hideous creature's face, and a mischievous delight in its twitchings. Then followed the dull and remote resonance of the 12 heavy strokes in the tower above. The women were impressed, and there was no giggle this time. The clergyman glided into the vestry, and the clerk vanished. The sergeant had not yet turned. Every woman in the church was waiting to see his face, and he appeared to know it. At last he did turn, and stalked resolutely down the nave, braving them all, with a compressed lip. 2 bowed and toothless old almsmen then looked at each other and chuckled innocently enough, but the sound had a strange weird effect in that place. Opposite to the church was a paved square, around which several overhanging wood buildings of old time cast a picturesque shade. The young man, on leaving the door, went to cross the square, when in the middle he met a little woman. The expression of her face, which had been one of intense anxiety, sank at the sight of his nearly to terror. "Well," he said in a suppressed passion, fixedly looking at her. "Oh, Frank, I made a mistake. I thought that the church with the spire was All Saints, and I was at the door at 11:30 to a minute, as you said. I waited till 11:45, and found then that I was at All Souls, but I wasn't much frightened, for I thought it could be tomorrow as well." "You fool, for fooling me. But say no more." "Shall it be tomorrow, Frank?" she asked blankly. "Tomorrow!" And he gave vent to a hoarse laugh. I won't go through that experience again for some time, I warrant you." "But after all," she expostulated in a trembling voice, "the mistake was not such a terrible thing. Now, dear Frank, when shall it be?" "When, God knows," he said with a light irony, and turning from her walked rapidly away. End of chapter 16. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 17. In the Market-place. On Saturday, Boldwood was in Casterbridge market-house as usual, when the disturber of his dreams entered and became visible to him. Adam had awakened from his deep sleep, and behold, there was Eve. The farmer took courage, and for the first time really looked at her. Material causes and emotional effects are not to be arranged in regular equation. The result from capital employment in the production of any movement of a mental nature is sometimes as tremendous as the cause itself is absurdly minute. When women are in a freakish mood, their usual intuition, either from carelessness or inherent defect, seemingly fails to teach them this, and hence it was that Bathsheba was fated to be astonished today. Boldwood looked at her, not slyly, critically, or understandingly, but blankly at gaze, in the way a reaper looks at a passing train, as something foreign to his element and but dimly understood. To Boldwood women had been remote phenomena rather than necessary complements, comets of such uncertain aspect, movement, and permanence that whether their orbits were as geometrical, unchangeable, and as subject to laws as his own, or as absolutely erratic as they superficially appeared, he had not deemed it his duty to consider. He saw her black hair, her correct facial curves and profile, and the roundness of her chin and throat. He saw then the side of her eyelids, eyes, and lashes, and the shape of her ear. Next he noticed her figure, her skirt, and the very soles of her shoes. Boldwood thought her beautiful, but wondered whether he was right in his thought, for it seemed impossible that this romance in the flesh, if so sweet as he imagined, could have been going on long without creating a commotion of delight among men, and provoking more inquiry than Bathsheba had done, even though that was not a little. To the best of his judgment, neither nature nor art could improve this perfect one of an imperfect many. His heart began to move within him. Boldwood, it must be remembered, though 40 years of age, had never before inspected a woman with the very centre and force of his glance. They had struck upon all his senses at wide angles. Was she really beautiful? He could not assure himself that this opinion was true even now. He furtively said to a neighbour, "Is Miss Everdene considered handsome?" "Oh, yes. She was a good deal noticed the first time she came, if you remember. A very handsome girl indeed." A man is never more credulous than in receiving favourable opinions on the beauty of a woman he is half, or quite in love with. A mere child's word on the point has the weight of an or-a's. Boldwood was satisfied now, and this charming woman had in effect said to him, "Marry me." Why should she have done that strange thing? Boldwood's blindness to the difference between approving of what circumstances suggest and originating what they do not suggest was well matched by Bathsheba's insensibility to the possibly great issues of little beginnings. She was at this moment coolly dealing with a dashing young farmer, adding up accounts with him as indifferently as if his face had been the pages of a ledger. It was evident that such a nature as his had no attraction for a woman of Bathsheba's taste. But Boldwood grew hot down to his hands with an incipient jealousy. He trod for the first time the threshold of the injured lover's hell. His first impulse was to go and thrust himself between them. This could be done, but only in one way, by asking to see a sample of her corn. Boldwood renounced the idea. He could not make the request. It was debasing loveliness to ask it to buy and sell, and jarred with his conceptions of her. All this time Bathsheba was conscious of having broken into that dignified stronghold at last. His eyes, she knew, were following her everywhere. This was a triumph, and had it come naturally, such a triumph would have been the sweeter to her for this piquing delay. But it had been brought about by misdirected ingenuity, and she valued it only as she valued an artificial flower or a wax fruit. Being a woman with some good sense in reasoning on subjects wherein her heart was not involved, Bathsheba genuinely repented that a freak which had owed its existence as much to Liddy as to herself should ever have been undertaken to disturb the placidity of a man she respected too highly to deliberately tease. She that day nearly formed the intention of begging his pardon on the very next occasion of their meeting. The worst features of this arrangement were that, if he thought she ridiculed him, an apology would increase the offence by being disbelieved, and if he thought she wanted him to woo her, it would read like additional evidence of her forwardness. End of chapter 17. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, chapter 18. Boldwood in meditation, regret. Boldwood was tenant of what was called Little Weatherbury Farm, and his person was the nearest approach to aristocracy that this remoter quarter of the parish could boast of. Genteel strangers, whose god was their town, who might happen to be compelled to linger about this nook for a day, heard the sound of light wheels, and prayed to see good society, to the degree of a solitary lord or squire at the very least, but it was only Mr. Boldwood going out for the day. They heard the sound of wheels yet once more, and were reanimated to expectancy. It was only Mr. Boldwood coming home again. His house stood recessed from the road, and the stables, which are to a farm what a fireplace is to a room, were behind, their lower portions being lost amid bushes of laurel. Inside the blue door, open half-way down, were to be seen at this time the backs and tails of half a dozen warm and contented horses standing in their stalls, and thus viewed they presented alternations of roan and bay in shapes like a Moorish arch, the tail being a streak down the midst of each. Over these, and lost to the eye gazing in from the outer light, the mouths of the same animals could be heard busily sustaining the above-named warmth and plumpness by quantities of oats and hay. The restless and shadowy figure of a colt wandered about a loose box at the end, whilst the steady grind of all the eaters was occasionally diversified by the rattle of a rope or the stamp of a foot. Pacing up and down at the heels of the animals was Farmer Boldwood himself. This place was his almonry and cloister in one. Here, after looking to the feeding of his four-footed dependents, the celibate would walk and meditate of an evening till the moon's rays streamed in through the cobwebbed windows, or total darkness enveloped the scene. His square-framed perpendicularity showed more fully now than in the crowd and bustle of the market-house. In this meditative walk his foot met the floor with heel and toe simultaneously, and his fine reddish-fleshed face was bent downwards just enough to render obscure the still mouth and the well-rounded though rather prominent and broad chin. A few clear and thread-like horizontal lines were the only interruption to the otherwise smooth surface of his large forehead. The phases of Boldwood's life were ordinary enough, but his was not an ordinary nature. That stillness which struck casual observers more than anything else in his character and habit, and seemed so precisely like the rest of inanition, may have been the perfect balance of enormous antagonistic forces, positives and negatives in fine adjustment. His equilibrium disturbed, he was in extremity at once. If an emotion possessed him at all, it ruled him. A feeling not mastering him was entirely latent. Stagnant or rapid, it was never slow. He was always hit mortally, or he was missed. He had no light and careless touches in his constitution, either for good or evil. Stern in the outlines of action, mild in the details, he was serious throughout all. He saw no absurd sides to the follies of life, and thus, though not quite companionable in the eyes of merry men and scoffers, and those to whom all things show life as a jest, he was not intolerable to the earnest and those acquainted with grief. Being a man who read all the dramas of life seriously, if he failed to please when they were comedies, there was no frivolous treatment to reproach him for when they chanced to end tragically. Bathsheba was far from dreaming that the dark and silent shape upon which she had so carelessly thrown a seed was a hotbed of tropic intensity. Had she known Boldwood's moods, her blame would have been fearful, and the stain upon her heart ineradicable. Moreover, had she known her present power for good or evil over this man, she would have trembled at the responsibility. Luckily for her present, unluckily for her future tranquillity, her understanding had not yet told her what Boldwood was. Nobody knew entirely, for though it was possible to form guesses concerning his wild capabilities from old flood marks faintly visible, he had never been seen at the high tides which caused them. Farmer Boldwood came to the stable door, and looked forth across the level fields. Beyond the first enclosure was a hedge, and on the other side was a meadow belonging to Bathsheba's farm. It was now early spring, the time of going to grass with the sheep, when they have the first feed of the meadows, before these are laid up for mowing. The wind, which had been blowing east for several weeks, had veered to the southward, and the middle of spring had come abruptly, almost without a beginning. It was that period in the vernal quarter when we may suppose the dryads to be waking for the season. The vegetable world begins to move and swell, and the saps to rise, till in the completest silence of lone gardens and trackless plantations, where everything seems helpless and still after the bond and slavery of frost, there are bustlings, strainings, united thrusts and pulls all together, in comparison with which the powerful tugs of cranes and pulleys in a noisy city are but pigmy efforts. Boldwood, looking into the distant meadows, saw there three figures. They were those of Miss Everdene, Shepherd Oak, and Cainy Ball. When Bathsheba's figure shone upon the farmer's eyes, it lighted him up, as the moon lights up a great tower. A man's body is as the shell or the tablet of a soul, as he is reserved or ingenuous, overflowing or self-contained. There was a change in Boldwood's exterior from its former impassibleness, and his face showed that he was now living outside his defences for the first time, and with a fearful sense of exposure. It is the usual experience of strong natures when they love. At last he arrived at a conclusion. It was to go across and inquire boldly of her. The insulation of his heart by reserve during these many years, without a channel of any kind for disposable emotion, had worked its effect. It had been observed more than once that the causes of love are chiefly subjective, and Boldwood was a living testimony to the truth of the proposition. No mother existed to absorb his devotion, no sister for his tenderness, no idle ties for sense. He became surcharged with the compound, which was genuine lover's love. He approached the gate of the meadow. Beyond it the ground was melodious with ripples, the sky with larks, the low bleating of the flock mingling with both. Mistress and man were engaged in the operation of making a lamb take, which is performed whenever a ewe has lost her own offspring, one of the twins of another ewe being given her as a substitute. Gabriel had skinned the dead lamb, and was tying the skin over the body of the live lamb in the customary manner, whilst Bathsheba was holding open a little pen of 4 hurdles, into which the mother and foisted lamb were driven, where they would remain till the old sheep conceives an affection for the young one. Bathsheba looked up at the completion of the manoeuvre, and saw the farmer by the gate, where he was overhung by a willow tree in full bloom. Gabriel, to whom her face was as the uncertain glory of an April day, was ever regardful of its faintest changes, and instantly discerned thereon the mark of some influence from without, in the form of a keenly self-conscious reddening. He also turned and beheld Boldwood. At once connecting these signs with the letter Boldwood had shown him, Gabriel suspected her of some coquettish procedure begun by that means, and carried on since he knew not how. Farmer Boldwood had read the pantomime denoting that they were aware of his presence, and the perception was as too much light turned upon his new sensibility. He was still in the road, and by moving on he hoped that neither would recognize that he had originally intended to enter the field. He passed by with an utter and overwhelming sensation of ignorance, shyness, and doubt. Perhaps in her manner there were signs that she wished to see him. Perhaps not. He could not read a woman. The Kabbalah of his erotic philosophy seemed to consist of the subtlest meanings expressed in misleading ways. Every turn, look, word, and accent contained a mystery quite distinct from its obvious import, and not one had ever been pondered by him until now. As for Bathsheba, she was not deceived into the belief that Farmer Boldwood had walked by on business or in idleness. She collected the probabilities of the case, and concluded that she was herself responsible for Boldwood's appearance there. It troubled her much to see what a great flame a little wildfire was likely to kindle. Bathsheba was no schemer for marriage, nor was she deliberately a trifler with the affections of men, and a censor's experience on seeing an actual flirt after observing her would have been a feeling of surprise that Bathsheba could be so different from such a one, and yet so like what a flirt is supposed to be. She resolved never again, by look or by sign, to interrupt the steady flow of this man's life, but a resolution to avoid an evil is seldom framed till the evil is so far advanced as to make avoidance impossible. End of chapter 18. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 19. The Sheep Washing. The Offer. Boldwood did eventually call upon her. She was not at home. Of course not, he murmured. In contemplating Bathsheba as a woman, he had forgotten the accidents of her position as an agriculturalist, that being as much of a farmer, and as extensive a farmer, as himself, her probable whereabouts was out of doors at this time of the year. This and the other oversights Boldwood was guilty of were natural to the mood, and still more natural to the circumstances. The great aids to idealization in love were present here: occasional observation of her from a distance, and the absence of social intercourse with her, visual familiarity, oral strangeness. The smaller human elements were kept out of sight. The pettinesses that enter so largely into all earthly living and doing were disguised by the accident of lover and loved one not being on visiting terms, and there was hardly awakened a thought in Boldwood that sorry household realities appertained to her, or that she, like all others, had moments of commonplace, when to be least plainly seen was to be most prettily remembered. Thus a mild sort of apotheosis took place in his fancy, whilst she still lived and breathed within his own horizon, a troubled creature like himself. It was the end of May when the farmer determined to be no longer repulsed by trivialities or distracted by suspense. He had by this time grown used to being in love. The passion now startled him less even when it tortured him more, and he felt himself adequate to the situation. On inquiring for her at her house, they had told him she was at the sheep washing, and he went off to seek her there. The sheep-washing pool was a perfectly circular basin of brickwork in the meadows, full of the clearest water. To birds on the wing, its glassy surface, reflecting the light sky, must have been visible for miles around, as a glistening cyclops eye in a green face. The grass about the margin at this season was a sight to remember long, in a minor sort of way. Its activity in sucking the moisture from the rich damp sod was almost a process observable by the eye. The outskirts of this level water meadow were diversified by rounded and hollow pastures, where just now every flower that was not a buttercup was a daisy. The river slid along noiselessly as a shade, the swelling reeds and sedge forming a flexible palisade upon its moist brink. To the north of the mead were trees, the leaves of which were new, soft, and moist, not yet having stiffened and darkened under summer sun and drought, their colour being yellow beside a green, green beside a yellow. From the recesses of this knot of foliage the loud notes of 3 cuckoos were resounding through the still air. Boldwood went meditating down the slopes with his eyes on his boots, which the yellow pollen from the buttercups had bronzed in artistic gradations. A tributary of the main stream flowed through the basin of the pool by an inlet and outlet at opposite points of its diameter. Shepherd Oak, Jan Coggan, Moon, Poorgrass, Cane Ball, and several others were assembled here, all dripping wet to the very roots of their hair, and Bathsheba was standing by in a new riding habit, the most elegant she had ever worn, the reins of her horse being looped over her arm. Flagons of cider were rolling about upon the green. The meek sheep were pushed into the pool by Coggan and Matthew Moon, who stood by the lower hatch immersed to their waists. Then Gabriel, who stood on the brink, thrust them under as they swam along, with an instrument like a crutch formed for the purpose, and also for assisting the exhausted animals when the wool became saturated and they began to sink. They were let out against the stream, and through the upper opening, all impurities flowing away below. Cainy Ball and Joseph, who performed this latter operation, were, if possible, wetter than the rest. They resembled dolphins under a fountain, every protuberance and angle of their clothes dribbling forth a small rill. Boldwood came close and bade her good morning with such constraint that she could not but think he had stepped across to the washing for its own sake, hoping not to find her there. More, she fancied his brow severe and his eyes slighting. Bathsheba immediately contrived to withdraw, and glided along by the river till she was a stone's throw off. She heard footsteps brushing the grass, and had a consciousness that love was encircling her like a perfume. Instead of turning or waiting, Bathsheba went further among the high sedges. But Boldwood seemed determined, and pressed on till they were completely past the bend of the river. Here, without being seen, they could hear the splashing and shouts of the washers above. "Miss Everdene," said the farmer. She trembled, turned, and said, "Good morning." His tone was so utterly removed from all she had expected as a beginning. It was lowness and quiet accentuated, an emphasis of deep meanings, their form at the same time being scarcely expressed. Silence has sometimes a remarkable power of showing itself as the disembodied soul of feeling wandering without its carcass, and it is then more impressive than speech. In the same way, to say a little is often to tell more than to say a great deal. Boldwood told everything in that word. As the consciousness expands on learning that what was fancied to be the rumble of wheels is the reverberation of thunder, so did Bathsheba's at her intuitive conviction. "I feel almost too much to think," he said with a solemn simplicity. "I have come to speak to you without preface. My life is not my own since I have beheld you clearly, Miss Everdene. I come to make you an offer of marriage." Bathsheba tried to preserve an absolutely neutral countenance, and all the motion she made was that of closing lips which had previously been a little parted. "I am now 41 years old," he went on. "I may have been called a confirmed bachelor, and I was a confirmed bachelor. I had never any views of myself as a husband in my earlier days, nor have I made any calculation on the subject since I have been older. But we all change, and my change in this matter came with seeing you. I have felt lately more and more that my present way of living is bad in every respect. Beyond all things, I want you as my wife." "I feel, Mr. Boldwood, that though I respect you much, I do not feel what would justify me in accepting your offer," she stammered. This giving back of dignity for dignity seemed to open the sluices of feeling that Boldwood had as yet kept closed. "My life is a burden without you," he exclaimed in a low voice. I want you to let me say I love you again and again." Bathsheba answered nothing, and the horse upon her arm seemed so impressed that instead of cropping the herbage she looked up. "I think and hope you care enough for me to listen to what I have to tell." Bathsheba's momentary impulse at hearing this was to ask why he thought that, till she remembered that, far from being a conceited assumption on Boldwood's part, it was but the natural conclusion of serious reflection based on deceptive premises of her own offering. "I wish I could say courteous flatteries to you," the farmer continued in an easier tone, "and put my rugged feeling into a graceful shape, but I have neither power nor patience to learn such things. I want you for my wife, so wildly that no other feeling can abide in me. But I should not have spoken out had I not been led to hope." "The Valentine again! Oh, that Valentine!" she said to herself, but not a word to him. "If you can love me, say so, Miss Everdene. If not, don't say no." "Mr. Boldwood, it is painful to have to say I am surprised, so that I don't know how to answer you with propriety and respect. But I'm only just able to speak out my feeling, I mean my meaning, that I am afraid I can't marry you, much as I respect you. You are too dignified for me to suit you, sir." "But, Miss Everdene—" "I didn't. I know I ought never have dreamt of sending that valentine. Forgive me, sir. It was a wanton thing which no woman with any self-respect would have done. If you will only pardon my thoughtlessness, I promise never to— No, no, no! Don't say thoughtlessness. Make me think it was something more, that it was a sort of prophetic instinct, the beginning of a feeling that you would like me. You torture me to say it was done in thoughtlessness. I never thought of it in that light, and I can't endure it. Ah, I wish I knew how to win you, but that I can't do. I can only ask if I have already got you. If I have not, and it is not true that you have come unwittingly to me as I have to you, I can say no more. I have not fallen in love with you, Mr. Boldwood. Certainly I must say that." She allowed a very small smile to creep for the first time over her serious face in saying this, and the white row of upper teeth and keenly cut lips already noticed suggested an idea of heartlessness which was immediately contradicted by the pleasant eyes.
But will you just think, in kindness and condescension, think, if you cannot bear with me as a husband? I fear I am too old for you, but believe me, I will take more care of you than would many a man of your own age. I will protect and cherish you with all my strength. I will indeed. You shall have no cares, be worried by no household affairs, and live quite at ease, Miss Everdene. The dairy superintendent shall be done by a man. I can afford it well. You shall never have so much as to look out of doors at haymaking time, or to think of weather in the harvest. I'd rather cling to the chaise, because it is the same my poor father and mother drove, but if you don't like it, I will sell it, and you shall have a pony carriage of your own. I cannot say how far above every other idea and object on earth you seem to me. Nobody knows, God only knows, how much you are to me." Bathsheba's heart was young, and it swelled with sympathy for the deep-natured man who spoke so simply. "Don't say it, don't! I cannot bear you to feel so much, and me to feel nothing. And I am afraid they will notice us, Mr. Boldwood. Will you let the matter rest now? I cannot think collectedly. I did not know you were going to say this to me. Oh, I am wicked to have made you suffer so." She was frightened as well as agitated at his vehemence. "Say then that you don't absolutely refuse. Do not quite refuse." "I can do nothing. I cannot answer." "I may speak to you again on the subject?" "Yes." "I may think of you?" "Yes, I suppose you may think of me." "And hope to obtain you?" "No, do not hope. Let us go on." "I will call upon you again tomorrow." "No, please not. Give me time." "Yes, I will give you any time," he said earnestly and gratefully. "I am happier now." "No, I beg you. Don't be happier if happiness only comes from my agreeing. Be neutral, Mr. Boldwood. I must think." "I will wait," he said. And then she turned away. Boldwood dropped his gaze to the ground, and stood long like a man who did not know where he was. Realities then returned upon him like the pain of a wound received in an excitement which eclipses it, and he, too, then went on. End of chapter 19. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 20. Perplexity, grinding the shears, a quarrel. "He is so disinterested and kind to offer me all that I can desire," Bathsheba mused. Yet Farmer Boldwood, whether by nature kind or the reverse to kind, did not exercise kindness here. The rarest offerings of the purest loves are but a self-indulgence and no generosity at all. Bathsheba, not being the least in love with him, was eventually able to look calmly at his offer. It was one which many women of her own station in the neighbourhood, and not a few of higher rank, would have been wild to accept and proud to publish. In every point of view, ranging from politic to passionate, it was desirable that she, a lonely girl, should marry, and marry this earnest, well-to-do, and respected man. He was close to her doors. His standing was sufficient. His qualities were even supererogatory. Had she felt, which she did not, any wish whatever for the married state in the abstract, she could not reasonably have rejected him, being a woman who frequently appealed to her understanding for deliverance from her whims. Boldwood as a means to marriage was unexceptionable. She esteemed and liked him, yet she did not want him. It appears that ordinary men take wives because possession is not possible without marriage, and that ordinary women accept husbands because marriage is not possible without possession. With totally differing aims, the method is the same on both sides. But the understood incentive on the woman's part was wanting here. Besides, Bathsheba's position as absolute mistress of a farm and house was a novel one, and the novelty had not yet begun to wear off. But a disquiet filled her which was somewhat to her credit, for it would have affected few. Beyond the mentioned reasons with which she combated her objections, she had a strong feeling that, having been the one who began the game, she ought in honesty to accept the consequences. Still the reluctance remained. She said in the same breath that it would be ungenerous not to marry Boldwood, and that she couldn't do it to save her life. Bathsheba's was an impulsive nature under a deliberative aspect.
An Elizabeth in brain, and a Mary Stuart in spirit, she often performed actions of the greatest temerity with a manner of extreme discretion. Many of her thoughts were perfect syllogisms. Unluckily, they always remained thoughts. Only a few were irrational assumptions, but unfortunately they were the ones which most frequently grew into deeds. The next day to that of the declaration she found Gabriel Oak at the bottom of the garden, grinding his shears for the sheep shearing. All the surrounding cottages were more or less scenes of the same operation. The scurr of whetting spread into the sky from all parts of the village, as from an armoury previous to a campaign. Peace and war kiss each other at their hours of preparation. Sickles, scythes, shears, and pruning hooks, ranking with swords, bayonets, and lances, in their common necessity for point and edge. Cainy Ball turned the handle of Gabriel's grindstone, his head performing a melancholy seesaw up and down with each turn of the wheel. Oak stood somewhat as Eros is represented when in the act of sharpening his arrows, his figure slightly bent, the weight of his body thrown over on the shears, and his head balanced sideways, with a critical compression of the lips and contraction of the eyelids to crown the attitude. His mistress came up and looked upon them in silence for a minute or two. Then she said, "Cain, go to the lower mead and catch the bay mare. I'll turn the winch of the grindstone. I want to speak to you, Gabriel." Cain departed, and Bathsheba took the handle. Gabriel had glanced up in intense surprise, quelled its expression, and looked down again. Bathsheba turned the winch, and Gabriel applied the shears. The peculiar motion involved in turning a wheel has a wonderful tendency to benumb the mind. It is a sort of attenuated variety of Ixion's punishment, and contributes a dismal chapter to the history of Gales. The brain gets muddled, the head grows heavy, and the body's centre of gravity seems to settle by degrees in a leaden lump somewhere between the eyebrows and the crown. Bathsheba felt the unpleasant symptoms after 2 or 3 dozen turns. "Will you turn, Gabriel, and let me hold the shears?" she said. "My head is in a whirl, and I can't talk." Gabriel turned. Bathsheba then began, with some awkwardness, allowing her thoughts to stray occasionally from her story to attend to the shears, which required a little nicety in sharpening. "I wanted to ask you if the men made any observations on my going behind the sedge with Mr. Boldwood yesterday?" "Yes, they did," said Gabriel. "You don't hold the shears right, miss. I knew you wouldn't know the way. Hold it like this." He relinquished the winch, and enclosing her 2 hands completely in his own, taking each as we sometimes clasp a child's hand in teaching him to write, grasped the shears with her. "Incline the edge so," he said. Hands and shears were inclined to suit the words, and held thus for a peculiarly long time by the instructor as he spoke. "That will do," exclaimed Bathsheba. "Loose my hands. I won't have them held. Turn the winch." Gabriel freed her hands quietly, retired to his handle, and the grinding went on. "Did the men think it odd?" she said again. "Odd was not the idea, miss." "What did they say?" "That Farmer Boldwood's name and your own were likely to be flung over the pulpit together before the year was out." "I thought so by the look of them. Why, there's nothing in it. A more foolish remark was never made, and I want you to contradict it. That's what I came for." Gabriel looked incredulous and sad, but between his moments of incredulity, relieved. "They must have heard our conversation," she continued. "Well, then, Bathsheba?" said Oak, stopping the handle and gazing into her face with astonishment. "Miss Everdene, you mean?" she said with dignity. "I mean this, that if Mr. Boldwood really spoke of marriage, I bain't going to tell a story and say he didn't to please you. I've already tried to please you too much for my own good." Bathsheba regarded him with round-eyed perplexity. She did not know whether to pity him for disappointed love of her, or to be angry with him for having got over it, his tone being ambiguous. "I said I wanted you just to mention that it was not true I was going to be married to him," she murmured, with a slight decline in her assurance. "I can say that to them if you wish, Miss Everdene, and I could likewise give an opinion to 'ee on what you have done." "I dare say, but I don't want your opinion." "I suppose not," said Gabriel bitterly, and going on with his turning, his words rising and falling in a regular swell and cadence as he stooped or rose with a winch, which directed them, according to his position, perpendicularly into the earth, or horizontally along the garden, his eyes being fixed on a leaf upon the ground. With Bathsheba, a hastened act was a rash act, but as does not always happen, time gained was prudence ensured. It must be added, however, that time was very seldom gained. At this period, the single opinion in the parish on herself and her doings that she valued as sounder than her own was Gabriel Oak's, and the outspoken honesty of his character was such that on any subject, even that of her love for or marriage with another man, the same disinterestedness of opinion might be calculated on, and be had for the asking. Thoroughly convinced of the impossibility of his own suit, a high resolve constrained him not to injure that of another. This is a lover's most stoical virtue, as the lack of it is a lover's most venial sin. Knowing he would reply truly, she asked the question, painful as she must have known the subject would be. Such is the selfishness of some charming women. Perhaps it was some excuse for her thus torturing honesty to her own advantage, that she had absolutely no other sound judgment within easy reach. "Well, what is your opinion of my conduct?" she said quietly. "That it is unworthy of any thoughtful and meek and comely woman." In an instant Bathsheba's face coloured with the angry crimson of a Danby sunset, but she forbore to utter this feeling, and the reticence of her tongue only made the loquacity of her face the more noticeable. The next thing Gabriel did was to make a mistake. "Perhaps you don't like the rudeness of my reprimanding you, for I know it is rudeness, but I thought it would do you good." She instantly replied sarcastically, "On the contrary, my opinion of you is so low that I see in your abuse the praise of discerning people." "I'm glad you don't mind it, for I said it honestly, and with every serious meaning." "I see. But unfortunately, when you try not to speak in jest, you are amusing, just as when you wish to avoid seriousness, you sometimes say a sensible word." It was a hard hit, but Bathsheba had unmistakably lost her temper, and on that account Gabriel had never in his life kept his own better. He said nothing. She then broke out. "I may ask, I suppose, where in particular my unworthiness lies? In my not marrying you, perhaps?" "Not by any means," said Gabriel quietly. "I have long given up thinking of that matter." "Or wishing it, I suppose," she said, and it was apparent that she expected an unhesitating denial of this supposition. Whatever Gabriel felt, he coolly echoed her words. "Or wishing it either. A woman may be treated with bitterness which is sweet to her, and with a rudeness which is not offensive." Bathsheba would have submitted to an indignant chastisement of her levity had Gabriel protested that he was loving her at the same time. The impetuosity of passion, unrequited, is bearable, even if it stings and anathematizes. There is a triumph in the humiliation, and a tenderness in the strife. This was what she had been expecting, and what she had not got. To be lectured because the lecturer saw her in the cold morning light of open-shuttered disillusion was exasperating. He had not finished either. He continued in a more agitated voice. "My opinion is, since you ask it, that you are greatly to blame for playing pranks upon a man like Mr. Boldwood, merely as a pastime. Leading on a man you don't care for is not a praiseworthy action, and even, Miss Everdene, if you seriously inclined towards him, you might have let him find it out in some way of true loving kindness, and not by sending him a Valentine's letter." Bathsheba laid down the shears. "I cannot allow any man to criticize my private conduct," she exclaimed, "nor will I for a minute. So you'll please leave the farm at the end of the week." It may have been a peculiarity, at any rate it was a fact, that when Bathsheba was swayed by an emotion of an earthly sort, her lower lip trembled, when by a refined emotion, her upper or heavenward one. Her nether lip quivered now. "Very well, so I will," said Gabriel calmly. He had been held to her by a beautiful thread, which it pained him to spoil by breaking, rather than by a chain he could not break. "I should be even better pleased to go at once," he added. "Go at once, then, in heaven's name," said she, her eyes flashing at his, though never meeting them. "Don't let me see your face any more." "Very well, Miss Everdene, so it shall be." And he took his shears and went away from her in a placid dignity, as Moses left the presence of Pharaoh. End of chapter 20. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, chapter 21. Troubles in the Fold, a Message. Gabriel Oak had ceased to feed the Weatherbury flock for about 24 hours, when on Sunday afternoon the elderly gentleman, Joseph Poorgrass, Matthew Moon, Fray, and half a dozen others came running up to the house of the mistress of the upper farm. "Whatever is the matter, men?" she said, meeting them at the door just as she was coming out on her way to church, and ceasing in a moment from the close compression of her two red lips, with which she had accompanied the exertion of pulling on a tight glove. 60, said Joseph Poorgrass. 70, said Moon. 59, said Susan Tall's husband. Sheep have broken fence, said Fray. And got into a field of young clover, said Tall. Young clover, said Moon. Clover, said Joseph Poorgrass. And they be getting blasted, said Henery Fray. That they be, said Joseph. And will all die as dead as nits if they bain't got out and cured, said Tall. Joseph's countenance was drawn into lines and puckers by his concern. Fray's forehead was wrinkled both perpendicularly and crosswise, after the pattern of a portcullis, expressive of a double despair. Laban Tall's lips were thin and his face rigid. Matthew's jaws sank, and his eyes turned whichever way the strongest muscle happened to pull them. "Yes," said Joseph, "and I was sitting at home looking for Ephesians, and I says to myself, 'tis nothing but Corinthians and Thessalonians in this dang Testament, when who should come in but Henery there. Joseph, he said, the sheep have blasted themselves.'" With Bathsheba it was a moment when thought was speech and speech exclamation. Moreover, she had hardly recovered her equanimity since the disturbance which she had suffered from Oak's remarks. "That's enough! That's enough! Oh, you fools!" she cried, throwing the parasol and prayer book into the passage, and running out of doors in the direction signified. "To come to me, and not go and get them out directly! Oh, the stupid numbskulls!" Her eyes were at their darkest and brightest now. Bathsheba's beauty belonging rather to the demonian than the angelic school, she never looked so well as when she was angry, and particularly when the effect was heightened by a rather dashing velvet dress, carefully put on before a glass. All the ancient men ran in a jumbled throng after her to the clover field, Joseph sinking down in the midst when about half-way, like an individual withering in a world which was more and more insupportable. Having once received the stimulus that her presence always gave them, they went round among the sheep with a will. The majority of the afflicted animals were lying down and could not be stirred. These were bodily lifted out, and the others driven into the adjoining field. Here, after the lapse of a few minutes, several more fell down and lay helpless and livid as the rest. Bathsheba, with a sad, bursting heart, looked at these primest specimens of her prime flock as they rolled there. Swollen with wind and the rank mist they drew. Many of them foamed at the mouth, their breathing being quick and short, whilst the bodies of all were fearfully distended. "Oh, what can I do? What can I do?" said Bathsheba helplessly. "Sheep are such unfortunate animals. There's always something happening to them. I never knew a flock pass a year without getting into some scrape or other." "There's only one way of saving them," said Tall. "What way? Tell me quick." "They must be pierced in the side with a thing made on purpose." "Can you do it? Can I?" "No, ma'am, we can't, nor you neither. It must be done in a particular spot. If you go to the right or left but an inch, you stab the ewe and kill her. Not even a shepherd can do it as a rule." "Then they must die," she said in a resigned tone. "Only one man in the neighbourhood knows the way," said Joseph, now just come up. "He could cure them all if he were here." "Who is he? Let's get him." "Shepherd Oak," said Matthew. "Ah, he's a clever man in talents." "Ah, that he is so," said Joseph Poorgrass. "True, he's the man," said Laban Tall. "How dare you name that man in my presence?" she said excitedly. "I told you never to allude to him,
nor shall you if you stay with me. Ah," she added, brightening, "Farmer Boldwood knows." "No, ma'am," said Matthew. "Two of his store ewes got into some vetches t'other day, and were just like these. He sent a man on horseback here post haste for Gable, and Gable went and saved him. Farmer Boldwood have got the thing they do it with. 'Tis a holler pipe with a sharp pricker inside, isn't it, Joseph?" "Ay, a holler pipe," echoed Joseph. "That's what 'tis." "Ah, sure, that's the machine," chimed in Henery Fray reflectively, with an oriental indifference to the flight of time. "Well," burst out Bathsheba, "don't stand there with your eyes and your shures talking at me. Get somebody to cure the sheep instantly." All then stalked off in consternation to get somebody as directed, without any idea of who it was to be. In a minute they had vanished through the gate, and she stood alone with the dying flock. "Never will I send for him, never," she said firmly. One of the ewes here contracted its muscles horribly, extended itself, and jumped high into the air. The leap was an astonishing one. The ewe fell heavily and lay still. Bathsheba went up to it. The sheep was dead. "Oh, what shall I do? What shall I do?" she again exclaimed, wringing her hands. "I won't send for him. No, I won't." The most vigorous expression of a resolution does not always coincide with the greatest vigour of the resolution itself. It is often flung out as a sort of prop to support a decaying conviction which, whilst strong, required no enunciation to prove it so. The "No, I won't" of Bathsheba meant virtually "I think I must." She followed her assistants through the gate and lifted her hand to one of them. Laban answered to her signal. "Where is Oak staying?" "Across the valley at Nest Cottage." "Jump on the bay mare and ride across, and say he must return instantly. That I say so." Tall scrambled off to the field, and in 2 minutes was on Poll the bay, bare-backed and with only a halter by way of rein. He diminished down the hill. Bathsheba watched, so did all the rest. Tall cantered along the bridle path, through 16 acres, sheeplands, Middlefield, the flats, Cappel's Piece, shrank almost to a point, crossed the bridge, and ascended from the valley through Springmead and Whitepits on the other side. The cottage to which Gabriel had retired before taking his final departure from the locality was visible as a white spot on the opposite hill, backed by blue firs. Bathsheba walked up and down. The men entered the field, and endeavoured to ease the anguish of the dumb creatures by rubbing them. Nothing availed. Bathsheba continued walking. The horse was seen descending the hill, and the wearisome series had to be repeated in reverse order. Whitepits, Springmead, Cappel's Piece, the flats, Middlefield, sheeplands, 16 acres. She hoped Tall had the presence of mind enough to give up the mare to Gabriel, and to return himself on foot. The rider neared them. It was Tall. "Oh, what folly!" said Bathsheba. Gabriel was not visible anywhere. "Perhaps he has already gone," she said. Tall came into the enclosure and leapt off, his face tragic as Morton's after the battle of Shrewsbury. "Well," said Bathsheba, unwilling to believe that her verbal lettre de cachet could possibly have miscarried. "He says beggars mustn't be choosers," replied Laban. "What?" said the young farmer, opening her eyes and drawing in her breath for an outburst. Joseph Poorgrass retired a few steps behind a hurdle. "He says he shall not come unless you request him to come civilly and in a proper manner, as becomes any woman begging a favour." "Oh, that's his answer. Where does he get his airs? Who am I, then, to be treated like that? Shall I beg a man who has begged to me?" Another of the flock sprang into the air and fell dead. The men looked grave, as if they suppressed opinion. Bathsheba turned aside, her eyes full of tears. The strait she was in through pride and shrewishness could not be disguised longer. She burst out crying bitterly. They all saw it, and she attempted no further concealment. "I wouldn't cry about it, miss," said William Smallbury compassionately. "Why not ask him softer like? I'm sure he'd come then. Gable is a true man in that way." Bathsheba checked her grief and wiped her eyes. "Oh, it is a wicked cruelty to me! It is, it is!" she murmured. and he drives me to do what I wouldn't. Yes, he does. Tall, come indoors." After this collapse, not very dignified for the head of an establishment, she went into the house, Tall at her heels. Here she sat down and hastily scribbled a note between the small convulsive sobs of convalescence which follow a fit of crying as a groundswell follows a storm. The note was none the less polite for being written in a hurry. She held it at a distance, was about to fold it, then added these words at the bottom: "Do not desert me, Gabriel." She looked a little redder in refolding it, and closed her lips, as if thereby to suspend till too late the action of conscience in examining whether such strategy were justifiable. The note was dispatched as the message had been, and Bathsheba waited indoors for the result. It was an anxious quarter of an hour that intervened between the messenger's departure and the sound of the horse's tramp again outside. She could not watch this time, but leaning over the old bureau at which she had written the letter, closed her eyes as if to keep out both hope and fear. The case, however, was a promising one. Gabriel was not angry, he was simply neutral, although her first command had been so haughty. Such imperiousness would have damned a little less beauty, and on the other hand such beauty would have redeemed a little less imperiousness. She went out when the horse was heard, and looked up. A mounted figure passed between her and the sky, and drew on towards the field of sheep, the rider turning his face in receding. Gabriel looked at her. It was a moment when a woman's eyes and tongue tell distinctly opposite tales. Bathsheba looked full of gratitude, and she said, "Oh, Gabriel, how could you serve me so unkindly?" Such a tenderly shaped reproach for his previous delay was the one speech in the language that he could pardon for not being commendation of his readiness now. Gabriel murmured a confused reply, and hastened on. She knew from the look which sentence in her note had brought him. Bathsheba followed to the field. Gabriel was already among the turgid, prostrate forms. He had flung off his coat, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and taken from his pocket the instrument of salvation. It was a small tube or trocar with a lance passing down the inside, and Gabriel began to use it with a dexterity that would have graced a hospital surgeon. Passing his hand over the sheep's left flank, and selecting the proper point, he punctured the skin and rumen with the lance as it stood in the tube. Then he suddenly withdrew the lance, retaining the tube in its place. A current of air rushed up the tube, forcible enough to have extinguished a candle held at the orifice. It has been said that mere ease after torment is delight for a time, and the countenances of these poor sheep expressed it now. 49 operations were successfully performed. Owing to the great hurry necessitated by the far-gone state of some of the flock, Gabriel missed his aim in one case, and in one only, striking wide of the mark, and inflicting a mortal blow at once on the suffering ewe. 4 had died, 3 recovered without an operation. The total number of sheep which had thus strayed and injured themselves so dangerously was 57. When the love-led man had ceased from his labours, Bathsheba came and looked him in the face. "Gabriel, will you stay on with me?" she said, smiling winningly, and not troubling to bring her lips quite together again at the end, because there was going to be another smile soon. "I will," said Gabriel, and she smiled on him again. End of chapter 21. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 22. The Great Barn and the Sheep Shearers. Men thin away into insignificance and oblivion quite as often by not making the most of good spirits when they have them, as by lacking good spirits when they are indispensable. Gabriel lately, for the first time since his prostration by misfortune, had been independent in thought and vigorous in action to a marked extent. Conditions which, powerless without an opportunity, as an opportunity without them is barren, would have given him a sure lift upwards when the favourable conjunction should have occurred. But this incurable loitering beside Bathsheba Everdene stole his time ruinously. The spring tides were going by without floating him off, and the neap might soon come, which could not. It was the first day of June, and the sheep-shearing season culminated, the landscape, even to the leanest pasture, being all health and colour.
Every green was young, every pore was open, and every stalk was swollen with racing currents of juice. God was palpably present in the country, and the devil had gone with the world to town. Flossy catkins of the later kinds, fern sprouts like bishops' croziers, the square-headed moschatels, the odd cuckoo spit, like an apoplectic saint in a niche of malachite, snow-white ladies' smocks, the toothworth, approximating to human flesh, the enchanter's nightshade, and the black-petalled doleful bells were among the quainter objects of the vegetable world in and about Weatherbury at this teeming time, and of the animal, the metamorphosed figures of Mr. Jan Coggan, the master shearer, the second and third shearers who travel in the exercise of their calling and do not require definition by name, Henry Frey, the fourth shearer, Susan Tall's husband, the fifth, Joseph Poorgrass, the sixth, young Cain Ball as assistant shearer, and Gabriel Oak as general supervisor. None of these were clothed to any extent worth mentioning, each appearing to have hit in the matter of raiment the decent mean between a high and low caste Hindu. An angularity of lineament and a fixity of facial machinery in general proclaimed that serious work was the order of the day. They sheared in the great barn, called for the nonce the shearing barn, which on ground plan resembled a church with transepts. It not only emulated the form of the neighbouring church of the parish, but vied with it in antiquity. Whether the barn had ever formed one of a group of conventual buildings, nobody seemed to be aware. No trace of such surroundings remained. The vast porches at the sides, lofty enough to admit a waggon laden to its highest with corn in the sheaf, were spanned by heavy pointed arches of stone, broadly and boldly cut, whose very simplicity was the origin of a grandeur not apparent with erections where more ornament has been attempted. The dusky, filmed chestnut roof, braced and tied in by huge collars, curves, and diagonals, was far nobler in design, because more wealthy in material, than 9/10 of those in our modern churches. Along each side wall was a range of striding buttresses, throwing deep shadows on the spaces between them, which were perforated by lancet openings, combining in their proportions the precise requirements both of beauty and ventilation. One could say about this barn what could hardly be said of either the church or the castle, akin to it in age and style, that the purpose which had dedicated its original erection was the same with that to which it was still applied. Unlike and superior to either of those two typical remnants of medievalism, the old barn embodied practices which had suffered no mutilation at the hands of time. Here at least the spirit of the ancient builders was at one with the spirit of the modern beholder. Standing before this abraded pile, the eye regarded its present usage, the mind dwelt upon its past history, with a satisfied sense of functional continuity throughout, a feeling almost of gratitude, and quite of pride, at the permanence of the idea which had heaped it up. The fact that 4 centuries had neither proved it to be founded on a mistake, inspired any hatred of its purpose, nor given rise to any reaction that had battered it down, invested this simple grey effort of old minds with a repose, if not a grandeur, which a too curious reflection was apt to disturb in its ecclesiastical and military compeers. For once, medievalism and modernism had a common standpoint. The Lancelot windows, the time-eaten archstones and chamfers, the orientation of the axes, the misty chestnut work of the rafters, referred to no exploded fortifying art or worn-out religious creed. The defence and salvation of the body by daily bread is still a study, a religion, and a desire. Today the large side doors were thrown open towards the sun to admit a bountiful light to the immediate spot of the shearers' operations, which was the wood threshing floor in the centre, formed of thick oak, blacked with age and polished by the beating of flails for many generations, till it had grown as slippery and as rich in hue as the state-room floors of an Elizabethan mansion. Here the shearers knelt, the sun slanting in upon their bleached shirts, tanned arms, and the polished shears they flourished, causing these to bristle with 1,000 rays strong enough to blind the weak-eyed man. Beneath them a captive sheep lay panting, quickening its pants as misgiving merged in terror, till it quivered like the hot landscape outside. This picture of today, in its frame of 400 years ago, did not produce that marked contrast between ancient and modern which is implied by the contrast of date. In comparison with cities, Weatherbury was immutable. The citizen's then is the rustic's now. In London, 20 or 30 years ago are old times. In Paris, 10 years or 5. In Weatherbury, 3 or 4 score years were included in the mere present, and nothing less than a century set a mark on its face or tone. 5 decades hardly modified the cut of a gaiter, the embroidery of a smock frock by the breadth of a hair. 10 generations failed to alter the turn of a single phrase. In these Wessex nooks the busy outsider's ancient times are only old, his old times are still new, his present is futurity. So the barn was natural to the shearers, and the shearers were in harmony with the barn. The spacious ends of the building, answering ecclesiastically to nave and chancel extremities, were fenced off with hurdles, the sheep being all collected in a crowd within these two enclosures, and in one angle a catching pen was formed, in which 3 or 4 sheep were continuously kept ready for the shearers to seize without loss of time. In the background, mellowed by tawny shade, were the 3 women, Mary Ann Money, and Temperance and Soberness Miller, gathering up the fleeces and twisting ropes of wool with a wimble for tying them round. They were indifferently well assisted by the old maltster, who, when the malting season from October to April had passed, made himself useful upon any of the bordering farmsteads. Behind them all was Bathsheba, carefully watching the men to see that there was no cutting or wounding through carelessness, and that the animals were shorn close. Gabriel, who flitted and hovered under her bright eyes like a moth, did not shear continuously, half his time being spent in attending to the others and selecting the sheep for them. At the present moment he was engaged in handing round a mug of mild liquor, supplied from a barrel in the corner, and cut pieces of bread and cheese. Bathsheba, after throwing a glance here, a caution there, and lecturing one of the younger operators who had allowed his last finished sheep to go off among the flock without re-stamping it with her initials, came again to Gabriel, as he put down the luncheon to drag a frightened ewe to his shear station, flinging it over upon its back with a dexterous twist of the arm. He lopped off the tresses about its head, and opened up the neck and collar, his mistress quietly looking on. "She blushes at the insult," murmured Bathsheba, watching the pink flush which arose and overspread the neck and shoulders of the ewe where they were left bare by the clicking shears, a flush which was enviable for its delicacy by many queens of coteries, and would have been creditable for its promptness to any woman in the world. Poor Gabriel's soul was fed with the luxury of content by having her over him, her eyes critically regarding his skilful shears, which apparently were going to gather up a piece of flesh at every close, and yet never did so. Like Guildenstern, Oak was happy in that he was not over-happy. He had no wish to converse with her. That his bright lady and himself formed one group, exclusively their own, and containing no others in the world, was enough. So the chatter was all on her side. There is a loquacity that tells nothing, which was Bathsheba's, and there is a silence which says much, that was Gabriel's. Full of this dim and temperate bliss, he went on to fling the ewe over upon her other side, covering her head with his knee, gradually running the shears line after line round her dewlap, thence about her flank and back, and finishing over the tail. "Well done, and done quickly," said Bathsheba, looking at her watch as the last snip resounded. "How long, miss?" said Gabriel, wiping his brow. 23 minutes and a half since you took the first lock from its forehead. It's the first time I've ever seen one done in less than half an hour. The clean, sleek creature arose from its fleece. How perfectly like Aphrodite rising from the foam should have been seen to be realized, looked startled and shy at the loss of its garment, which lay on the floor in one soft cloud, united throughout, the portion visible being the inner surface only, which, never before exposed, was white as snow, and without flaw or blemish of the minutest kind. "Cane Ball!" "Yes, Mr. Oak, here I be." Cainy now runs forward with the tar pot. B.E. is newly stamped upon the shorn skin, and away the simple dam leaps, panting, over the board into the shirtless flock outside. Then up comes Mary Ann, throws the loose locks into the middle of the fleece, rolls it up, and carries it to the background as 3½ pounds of unadulterated warmth for the winter enjoyment of persons unknown and far away, who will, however, never experience the superlative comfort derivable from the wool as it here exists, new and pure, before the uncouthness of its nature whilst in a living state has dried, stiffened, and been washed out, rendering it just now as superior to anything woolen as cream is superior to milk and water. But heartless circumstance could not leave entire Gabriel's happiness of this morning. The rams, old ewes, and two-shear ewes had duly undergone their stripping, and the men were proceeding with the shearlings and hogs, when Oak's belief that she was going to stand pleasantly by and time him through another performance was painfully interrupted by Farmer Boldwood's appearance in the extremest corner of the barn. Nobody seemed to have perceived his entry, but there he certainly was. Boldwood always carried with him a social atmosphere of his own, which everybody felt who came near him, and the talk, which Bathsheba's presence had somewhat suppressed, was now totally suspended. He crossed over towards Bathsheba, who turned to greet him with a carriage of perfect ease. He spoke to her in low tones, and she instinctively modulated her own to the same pitch, and her voice ultimately even caught the inflection of his. She was far from having a wish to appear mysteriously connected with him, but woman at the impressionable age gravitates to the larger body, not only in her choice of words, which is apparent every day, but even in her shades of tone and humour, when the influence is great. What they conversed about was not audible to Gabriel, who was too independent to get near, though too concerned to disregard. The issue of the dialogue was the taking of her hand by the courteous farmer to help her over the spreading board into the bright June sunlight outside. Standing beside the sheep already shorn, they went on talking again. Concerning the flock? Apparently not. Gabriel theorized, not without truth, that in quiet discussion of any matter within reach of the speaker's eyes, these are usually fixed upon it. Bathsheba demurely regarded a contemptible straw lying upon the ground, in a way which suggested less ovine criticism than womanly embarrassment. She became more or less red in the cheek, the blood wavering in uncertain flux and reflux over the sensitive space between ebb and flood. Gabriel sheared on, constrained and sad. She left Boldwood's side, and he walked up and down alone for nearly a quarter of an hour. Then she reappeared in her new riding habit of myrtle green, which fitted her to the waist as a rind fits its fruit, and young Bob Coggan led on her mare, Boldwood fetching his own horse from the tree under which it had been tied. Oak's eyes could not forsake them, and in endeavouring to continue his shearing at the same time that he watched Boldwood's manner, he snipped the sheep in the groin. The animal plunged. Bathsheba instantly gazed towards it and saw the blood. "Oh, Gabriel!" she exclaimed with severe remonstrance. "You, who are so strict with the other men, see what you are doing yourself." To an outsider there was not much to complain of in this remark, but to Oak, who knew Bathsheba to be well aware that she herself was the cause of the poor ewe's wound, because she had wounded the ewe's shearer in a still more vital part, it had a sting which the abiding sense of his inferiority to both herself and Boldwood was not calculated to heal. But a manly resolve to recognize boldly that he had no longer a lover's interest in her helped him occasionally to conceal a feeling. "Bottle!" he shouted in an unmoved voice of routine. Cainy Ball ran up, the wound was anointed, and the shearing continued. Boldwood gently tossed Bathsheba into the saddle, and before they turned away she again spoke out to Oak with the same dominative and tantalizing graciousness. "I am going now to see Mr. Boldwood's Leicesters. Take my place in the barn, Gabriel, and keep the men carefully to their work." The horses' heads were put about, and they trotted away. Boldwood's deep attachment was a matter of great interest among all around him, but having been pointed out for so many years as the perfect exemplar of thriving bachelorship, his lapse was an anticlimax somewhat resembling that of St. John Long's death by consumption in the midst of his proofs that it was not a fatal disease. "That means matrimony," said Temperance Miller, following them out of sight with her eyes. "I reckon that's the size of it," said Coggan, working along without looking up. "Well, better went over the mixing than over the moor," said Laban Tall, turning his sheep. Henry Fray spoke, exhibiting miserable eyes at the same time. "I don't see why the maid should take a husband when she's bold enough to fight her own battles, and don't want a home,
for 'tis keeping another woman out. But let it be, for 'tis a pity he and she should trouble two houses." As usual with decided characters, Bathsheba invariably provoked the criticism of individuals like Henery Fray. Her emblazoned fault was to be too pronounced in her objections, and not sufficiently overt in her likings. We learn that it is not the rays which bodies absorb, but those which they reject that give them the colours they are known by, and in the same way people are specialized by their dislikes and antagonisms, whilst their goodwill is looked upon as no attribute at all. Henry continued in a more complacent mood. "I once hinted my mind to her on a few things, as nearly as a battered frame dared to do so to such a forward piece. You all know, neighbours, what a man I be, and how I come down with my powerful words when my pride is boiling with scorn." We do, Henery." "So I said, 'Mistress Everdene, there's places empty, and there's gifted men willing. But the spite—no, not the spite, I didn't say spite, but the villainy of the contrary kind,' said I, meaning womankind, 'keeps 'em out.' That wasn't too strong for her, say?" "Passably well put." "Yes, and I would have said it, and death and salvation overtook me for it. Such is my spirit when I have a mind." "A true man, and proud as a Lucifer." "You see the artfulness? Why, 'twas about being Bailey, really, but I didn't put it so plain that she could understand my meaning, so I could lay it on all the stronger. That was my depth. However, let her marry, and she will. Perhaps 'tis high time. I believe Farmer Boldwood kissed her behind the spear bed at the sheep washing t'other day. That I do." "What a lie!" said Gabriel. "Ah, neighbour Oak, how'st know?" said Henery mildly. "Because she told me all that passed," said Oak, with a pharisaical sense that he was not as other shearers in this matter. "Ye have a right to believe it," said Henery with dudgeon. "A very true right. But I mid see a little distance into things. To be long-headed enough for a bailie's place is a poor mere trifle, yet a trifle more than nothing. However, I look round upon life quite cool. Do you heed me, neighbours? My words, though made as simple as I can, mid be rather deep for some heads." "Oh yes, Henry, we quite heed ye." "A strange old piece, good men, whirled about from here to yonder as if I were nothing. A little warped too, but I have my depths. Ha, and even my great depths. I might gear at a certain shepherd, brain to brain, but no, oh no." "A strange old piece, you say?" interposed the maltster in a querulous voice. "At the same time you be no old man worth naming. No, no old man at all. Your teeth bain't half gone yet, and what's a old man standing if so be his teeth bain't gone? Weren't I stale in wedlock afore ye were out of arms? 'Tis a poor thing to be 60 when there's people past 80, a boast weak as water." It was the unvarying custom in Weatherbury to sink minor differences when the maltster had to be pacified. "Weak as water, yes," said Jan Coggan. "Malter, I feel ye to be a wonderful veteran man, and nobody can gainsay it." "Nobody," said Joseph Poorgrass. "Ye be a very rare old spectacle, Malter, and we all admire ye for that gift." "Ah, as a young man, when my senses were in prosperity, I was likewise liked by a good few who knowed me," said the maltster. "Without doubt you was, without doubt." The bent and hoary man was satisfied, and so apparently was Henery Fray. That matters should continue pleasant, Maryann spoke, who, what with her brown complexion and the working wrapper of rusty linsey, had at present the mellow hue of an old sketch in oils, notably some of Nicholas Poussin's. "Do anybody know of a crooked man, or a lame, or any second-hand fellow at all that would do for poor me?" said Maryann. "A perfect one I don't expect to get at my time of life. If I could hear of such a thing, 'twould do me more good than toast and ale." Coggan furnished a suitable reply. Oak went on with his shearing and said not another word. Pestilent moods had come and teased away his quiet. Bathsheba had shown indications of anointing him above his fellows by installing him as the bailiff that the farm imperatively required. He did not covet the post relatively to the farm. In relation to herself, as beloved by him and unmarried to another, he had coveted it.
His readings of her seemed now to be vapoury and indistinct. His lecture to her was, he thought, one of the absurdest mistakes. Far from coquetting with Boldwood, she had trifled with him in thus feigning that she had trifled with another. He was inwardly convinced that, in accordance with the anticipations of his easy-going and worse-educated comrades, that day would see Boldwood the accepted husband of Miss Everdene. Gabriel, at this time of his life, had outgrown the instinctive dislike which every Christian boy has for reading the Bible, perusing it now quite frequently, and he inwardly said, "I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart it snares and nets." This was mere exclamation, the froth of the storm. He adored Bathsheba just the same. "We work folk shall have some lordly junketing to-night," said Cainy Ball, casting forth his thoughts in a new direction. "This morning I see them making great puddings in the milking pails, lumps of fat as big as your thumb, Mr. Oak. I never seed such splendid large knobs of fat before in the days of my life. They never used to be bigger than a horse bean. And there was a great black crock upon the brandish with its legs a sticking out, but I don't know what was in within. And there's 2 bushels of biffins for apple pies," said Mary Ann. "Well, I hope to do my duty by it all," said Joseph Poorgrass in a pleasant masticating manner of anticipation. "Yes, victuals and drink is a cheerful thing, and gives nerves to the nerveless, if the form of words may be used. 'Tis a gospel of the body, without which we perish, so to speak it." End of chapter 22. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 23. Eventide, a second declaration. For the shearing supper a long table was placed on the grass plot beside the house, the end of the table being thrust over the sill of the wide parlour window and a foot or two into the room. Miss Everdene sat inside the window, facing down the table. She was thus at the head, without mingling with the men. This evening Bathsheba was unusually excited, her red cheeks and lips contrasting lustrously with the mazy skeins of her shadowy hair. She seemed to expect assistance, and the seat at the bottom of the table was, at her request, left vacant until after they had begun the meal. She then asked Gabriel to take the place and the duties appertaining to that end, which he did with great readiness. At this moment Mr. Boldwood came in at the gate, and crossed the green to Bathsheba at the window. He apologized for his lateness. His arrival was evidently by arrangement. "Gabriel," she said, "will you move again, please, and let Mr. Boldwood come there?" Oak moved in silence back to his original seat. The gentleman farmer was dressed in a cheerful style, in a new coat and white waistcoat, quite contrasting with his usual sober suits of grey. Inwardly, too, he was blithe, and consequently chatty to an exceptional degree. So also was Bathsheba now that he had come, though the uninvited presence of Pennyways, the bailiff who had been dismissed for theft, disturbed her equanimity for a while. Supper being ended, Coggan began on his own private account, without reference to listeners. "I've lost my love, and I care not. I've lost my love, and I care not. I shall soon have another, that's better than t'other. I've lost my love, and I care not." This lyric, when concluded, was received with a silently appreciative gaze at the table, implying that the performance, like a work by those established authors who were independent of notices in the papers, was a well-known delight which required no applause. "Now, Master Poorgrass, your song," said Coggan. "I be all but in liquor, and the gift is wanting in me," said Joseph, diminishing himself. "Nonsense! Wouldst never be so ungrateful, Joseph, never," said Coggan, expressing hurt feelings by an inflection of voice. "And mistress is looking hard at ye as much to say, 'Sing at once, Joseph Poorgrass.'" "Faith, so she is. Well, I must suffer it. Just eye my features and see if the tell-tale blood overheats me much, neighbours." "No, your blushes be quite reasonable," said Coggan. "I always tries to keep my colours from rising when a beauty's eyes get fixed on me," said Joseph differently. "But if so be 'tis will they do, they must." "Now, Joseph, your song, please," said Bathsheba from the window. "Well, really, ma'am,"
he replied in a yielding tone. "I don't know what to say. It would be a poor plain ballad of my own composure." "Hear, hear," said the supper party. Poorgrass, thus assured, trilled forth a flickering yet commendable piece of sentiment, the tune of which consisted of the keynote and another, the latter being the sound chiefly dwelt upon. This was so successful that he rashly plunged into a second in the same breath after a few false starts. I sowed the, I sowed, I sowed the seeds of love. It was all in the spring, in April, May, and sunny June, when small birds they do sing. "Well put out of hand," said Coggan at the end of the verse. "They do sing was a very taking paragraph. Ah, and there was a very pretty piece at Seeds of Love, and 'twas well heaved out, though love is a nasty high corner when a man's voice is getting crazed. Next verse, Master Poorgrass." During this rendering young Bob Coggan exhibited one of those anomalies which will afflict little people when other persons are particularly serious. In trying to check his laughter, he pushed down his throat as much of the tablecloth as he could get hold of, when after continuing hermetically sealed for a short time, his mirth burst out through his nose. Joseph perceived it, and with hectic cheeks of indignation instantly ceased singing. Coggan boxed Bob's ears immediately. "Go on, Joseph, go on, and never mind the young scamp," said Coggan. "'Tis a very catching ballad. Now, then again, the next bar. I'll help you to flourish up the shrill notes when your wind is rather wheezy. Oh, the willow tree will twist, and the willow tree will twine." But the singer could not be set going again. Bob Coggan was sent home for his ill manners, and tranquillity was restored by Jacob Smallbury, who volunteered a ballad as inclusive and interminable as that with which the worthy toper old Silenus amused on a similar occasion the swains Chromis and Mesilas and other jolly dogs of his day. It was still the beaming time of evening, though night was stealthily making itself visible low down upon the ground, the western lines of light raking the earth without lighting upon it to any extent, or illuminating the dead levels at all. The sun had crept round the trees as a last effort before death, and then began to sink, the shearers' lower parts becoming steeped in embrowning twilight, whilst their heads and shoulders were still enjoying day, touched with a yellow of self-sustained brilliancy that seemed inherent rather than acquired. The sun went down in an ochreous mist, but they sat and talked on, and grew as merry as the gods in Homer's heaven. Bathsheba still remained enthroned inside the window, and occupied herself in knitting, from which she sometimes looked up to view the fading scene outside. The slow twilight expanded and enveloped them completely before the signs of moving were shown. Gabriel suddenly missed Farmer Boldwood from his place at the bottom of the table. How long he had been gone Oak did not know, but he had apparently withdrawn into the encircling dusk. Whilst he was thinking of this, Liddy brought candles into the back part of the room overlooking the shearers, and their lively new flames shone down the table and over the men, and dispersed among the green shadows behind. Bathsheba's form, still in its original position, was now again distinct between their eyes and the light, which revealed that Boldwood had gone inside the room, and was sitting near her. Next came the question of the evening. Would Miss Everdene sing to them the song she always sang so charmingly, "The Banks of Allan Water," before they went home? After a moment's consideration, Bathsheba assented, beckoning to Gabriel, who hastened up to the coveted atmosphere. "Have you brought your flute?" she whispered. "Yes, miss." "Play to my singing, then." She stood up in the window opening, facing the men, the candles behind her, Gabriel on her right hand, immediately outside the sash frame. Boldwood had drawn up on her left within the room. Her singing was soft and rather tremulous at first, but it soon swelled to a steady clearness. Subsequent events caused one of the verses to be remembered for many months and even years by more than one of those who were gathered there. For his bride a soldier sought her, and a winning tongue had he. On the banks of Allan Water none was gay as she. In addition to the dulcet piping of Gabriel's flute, Boldwood supplied a bass in his customary profound voice, uttering his notes so softly, however, as to abstain entirely from making anything like an ordinary duet of the song. They rather formed a rich, unexplored shadow, which threw her tones into relief. The shearers reclined against each other as at suppers in the early ages of the world, and so silent and absorbed were they that her breathing could almost be heard between the bars, and at the end of the ballad, when the last tone loitered to an inexpressible close, there arose that buzz of pleasure which is the attar of applause. It is scarcely necessary to state that Gabriel could not avoid noting the farmer's bearing tonight towards their entertainer. Yet there was nothing exceptional in his actions beyond what appertained to his time of performing them. It was when the rest were all looking away that Boldwood observed her. When they regarded her, he turned aside. When they thanked or praised her, he was silent. When they were inattentive, he murmured his thanks. The meaning lay in the difference between actions, none of which had any meaning in itself, and the necessity of being jealous, which lovers are troubled with, did not lead Oak to underestimate these signs. Bathsheba then wished him good night, withdrew from the window, and retired to the back part of the room, Boldwood thereupon closing the sash and the shutters and remaining inside with her. Oak wandered away under the quiet and scented trees. Recovering from the softer impressions produced by Bathsheba's voice, the shearers rose to leave, Coggan turning to Pennyways as he pushed back the bench to pass out. "I like to give praise where praise is due, and the man deserves it, that 'a do so," he remarked, looking at the worthy thief, as if he were the masterpiece of some world-renowned artist. "I'm sure I would never have believed it if we hadn't proved it, so to allude," hiccuped Joseph Poorgrass, "that every cup, every one of the best knives and forks, and every empty bottle be in their place as perfect now as at the beginning, and not one stole at all." "I'm sure I don't deserve half the praise you give me," said the virtuous thief grimly. "Well, I'll say this for Pennyways," added Coggan, "that whenever he do really make up his mind to do a noble thing in the shape of a good action, as I could see by his face he did tonight afore sitting down, he's generally able to carry it out. Yes, I'm proud to say, neighbours, that he stole nothing at all." "Well, 'tis an honest deed, and we thank ye for it, Pennyways," said Joseph, to which opinion the remainder of the company subscribed unanimously. At this time of departure, when nothing more was visible from the inside of the parlour than a thin and still chink of light between the shutters, a passionate scene was in course of enactment there. Miss Everdene and Boldwood were alone. Her cheeks had lost a great deal of their healthful fire from the very seriousness of her position, but her eye was bright with the excitement of a triumph, though it was a triumph which had been rather contemplated than desired. She was standing behind a low armchair, from which she had just risen, and he was kneeling in it, inclining himself over its back towards her, and holding her hand in both of his own. His body moved restlessly, and it was with what Keats daintily calls a too happy happiness. This unwonted abstraction by love of all dignity from a man of whom it had ever seemed the chief component was, in its distressing incongruity, a pain to her, which quenched much of the pleasure she derived from the proof that she was idolized. "I will try to love you," she was saying in a trembling voice quite unlike her usual self-confidence. "And if I can believe in any way that I shall make you a good wife, I shall indeed be willing to marry you. But, Mr. Boldwood, hesitation on so high a matter is honourable in any woman, and I don't want to give a solemn promise tonight. I would rather ask you to wait a few weeks till I can see my situation better." "But you have every reason to believe that then—" "I have every reason to hope that at the end of the 5 or 6 weeks, between this time and the harvest, that you say you are going to be away from home, I shall be able to promise to be your wife," she said firmly. "But remember this distinctly, I don't promise yet." "It is enough. I don't ask more. I can wait on those dear words. And now, Miss Everdene, good night." "Good night," she said graciously, almost tenderly, and Boldwood withdrew with a serene smile. Bathsheba knew more of him now. He had entirely bared his heart before her, even until he had almost worn in her eyes the sorry look of a grand bird without the feathers that make it grand. She had been awestruck at her past temerity, and was struggling to make amends without thinking whether the sin quite deserved the penalty she was schooling herself to pay. To have brought all this about her ears was terrible, but after a while the situation was not without a fearful joy. The facility with which even the most timid women sometimes acquire a relish for the dreadful, when that is amalgamated with a little triumph, is marvellous. End of chapter 23.
Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 24. The same night, the fir plantation. Among the multifarious duties which Bathsheba had voluntarily imposed upon herself by dispensing with the services of a bailiff, was the particular one of looking round the homestead before going to bed, to see that all was right and safe for the night. Gabriel had almost constantly preceded her in this tour every evening, watching her affairs as carefully as any specially appointed officer of surveillance could have done. But this tender devotion was to a great extent unknown to his mistress, and as much as was known was somewhat thanklessly received. Women are never tired of bewailing man's fickleness in love, but they only seem to snub his constancy. As watching is best done invisibly, she usually carried a dark lantern in her hand, and every now and then turned on the lantern to examine nooks and corners with the coolness of a metropolitan policeman. This coolness may have owed its existence not so much to her fearlessness of expected danger as to her freedom from the suspicion of any. Her worst anticipated discovery being that a horse might not be well bedded, the fowls not all in, or a door not closed. This night the buildings were inspected as usual, and she went round to the farm paddock. Here the only sounds disturbing the stillness were steady munchings of many mouths, and stentorian breathings from all but invisible noses, ending in snores and puffs like the blowing of bellows slowly. Then the munching would recommence, when the lively imagination might assist the eye to discern a group of pink-white nostrils, shaped as caverns, and very clammy and humid on their surfaces, not exactly pleasant to the touch until one got used to them, the mouths beneath having a great partiality for closing upon any loose end of Bathsheba's apparel which came within reach of their tongues. Above each of these a still keener vision suggested a brown forehead and two staring, though not unfriendly eyes, and above all a pair of whitish crescent-shaped horns, like two particularly new moons. An occasional stolid moo, proclaiming beyond the shade of a doubt that these phenomena were the features of the persons of Daisy, Whitefoot, Bonny Lass, Jolly-O, Spot, Twinkle-Eye, etc., etc., the respectable dairy of Devon cows belonging to Bathsheba aforesaid. Her way back to the house was by a path through a young plantation of tapering firs, which had been planted some years earlier to shelter the premises from the north wind. By reason of the density of the interwoven foliage overhead, it was gloomy there at cloudless noontide, twilight in the evening, dark as midnight at dusk, and black as the ninth plague of Egypt at midnight. To describe the spot is to call it a vast, low, naturally formed hall, the plumy ceiling of which was supported by slender pillars of living wood, the floor being covered with a soft dun carpet of dead spikelets and mildewed cones, with a tuft of grass blades here and there. This bit of the path was always the crux of the night's ramble, though before starting her apprehensions of danger were not vivid enough to lead her to take a companion. Slipping along here covertly as time, Bathsheba fancied she could hear footsteps entering the track at the opposite end. It was certainly a rustle of footsteps. Her own instantly fell as gently as snowflakes. She reassured herself by a remembrance that the path was public, and that the traveller was probably some villager returning home, regretting at the same time that the meeting should be about to occur in the darkest point of her route, even though just outside her own door. The noise approached, came close, and the figure was apparently on the point of gliding past her, when something tugged at her skirt and pinned it forcibly to the ground. The instantaneous check nearly threw Bathsheba off her balance. In recovering, she struck against warm clothes and buttons. "A rum start, upon my soul," said a masculine voice a foot or so above her head. "Have I hurt you, mate?" "No," said Bathsheba, attempting to shrink away. "We have got hitched together somehow, I think." "Yes." "Are you a woman?" "Yes." "A lady, I should have said." "It doesn't matter." "I am a man." "Oh!" Bathsheba softly tugged again, but to no purpose. "Is that a dark lantern you have? I fancy so," said the man. "Yes." "If you'll allow me, I'll open it and set you free." His hand seized the lantern. The door was opened, The rays burst out from their prison, and Bathsheba beheld her position with astonishment. The man to whom she was hooked was brilliant in brass and scarlet. He was a soldier. His sudden appearance was to darkness what the sound of a trumpet is to silence. Gloom, the genius loci at all times hitherto, was now totally overthrown, less by the lantern light than by what the lantern lighted. The contrast of this revelation with her anticipations of some sinister figure in sombre garb was so great that it had upon her the effect of a fairy transformation. It was immediately apparent that the military man's spur had become entangled in the gimp which decorated the skirt of her dress. He caught a view of her face. "I'll unfasten you in one moment, miss," he said with newborn gallantry. "Oh, no, I can do it, thank you," she hastily replied, and stooped for the performance. The unfastening was not such a trifling affair. The rowel of the spur had so wound itself among the gimp cords in those few moments that separation was likely to be a matter of time. He too stooped, and the lantern, standing on the ground betwixt them, threw a gleam from its open side among the fir-tree needles and the blades of long damp grass, with the effect of a large glow-worm. It radiated upwards into their faces, and sent over half the plantation gigantic shadows of both man and woman, each dusky shape becoming distorted and mangled upon the tree trunks till it was wasted to nothing. He looked hard into her eyes when she raised them for a moment. Bathsheba looked down again, for his gaze was too strong to be received point blank with her own. But she had obliquely noticed that he was young and slim, and that he wore 3 chevrons upon his sleeve. Bathsheba pulled again. "You are a prisoner, miss. It's no use blinking the matter," said the soldier dryly. "I must cut your dress if you are in such a hurry." "Yes, please do," she exclaimed helplessly. "It wouldn't be necessary if you could wait a moment." And he unwound a cord from the little wheel. She withdrew her own hand, but whether by accident or design he touched it. Bathsheba was vexed, she hardly knew why. His unravelling went on, but it nevertheless seemed coming to no end. She looked at him again. "Thank you for the sight of such a beautiful face," said the young sergeant without ceremony. She coloured with embarrassment. "'Twas unwillingly shown," she replied stiffly, and with as much dignity, which was very little, as she could infuse into a position of captivity. "I like you the better for that incivility, miss," he said. "I should have liked. I wish you had never shown yourself to me by intruding here." She pulled again, and the gathers of her dress began to give way, like Lilliputian musketry. "I deserve the chastisement your words give me, but why should such a fair and dutiful girl have such an aversion to her father's sex?" "Go on your way, please." "What, Beauty, and drag you after me? Do but look. I never saw such a tangle." "Oh, 'tis shameful of you. You have been making it worse on purpose to keep me here. You have." "Indeed, I don't think so," said the sergeant with a merry twinkle. "I tell you you have," she exclaimed in high temper. "I insist upon undoing it. Now allow me." "Certainly, miss. I am not of steel," he added with a sigh which had as much archness in it as a sigh could possess, without losing its nature altogether. "I am thankful for beauty, even when it's thrown to me like a bone to a dog. These moments will be over too soon." She closed her lips in a determined silence. Bathsheba was revolving in her mind whether by a bold and desperate rush she could free herself at the risk of leaving her skirt bodily behind her. The thought was too dreadful. The dress, which she had put on to appear stately at the supper, was the head and front of her wardrobe. Not another in her stock became her so well. What woman in Bathsheba's position, not naturally timid, and within call of her retainers, would have bought escape from a dashing soldier at so dear a price? "All in good time. It will soon be done, I perceive," said her cool friend.
"This trifling provokes, and
"Not too cruel."
insults me."
"It is done in order that I may have the pleasure of apologizing to so charming a woman, which I straightway do most humbly, madam," he said, bowing low. Bathsheba really knew not what to say. "I have seen a good many women in my time," continued the man in a murmur, and more thoughtfully than hitherto, critically regarding her bent head at the same time. "But I've never seen a woman so beautiful as you. Take it or leave it, be offended or like it, I don't care."
Who are you, then, who can so well afford to despise opinion?
"No stranger. Sergeant Troy. I am staying at this place. There, it is undone at last, you see. Your light fingers were more eager than mine. I wish it had been the knot of knots which there is no untying."
This was worse and worse. She started up, and so did he. How to decently get away from him, that was her difficulty now. She sidled off inch by inch, the lantern in her hand, till she could see the redness of his coat no longer.
"Ah, beauty, good-bye," he said. She made no reply, and reaching a distance of 20 or 30 yards, turned about and ran indoors. Liddy had just retired to rest. In ascending to her own chamber, Bathsheba opened the girl's door an inch or two, and, panting, said,
Liddy, is any soldier staying in the village? Sergeant somebody, rather gentlemanly for a sergeant, and good-looking, a red coat with blue facings.
"No, miss."
No, say I, but really it might be Sergeant Troy home on furlough, though I have not seen him.
He was here once in that way when the regiment was at Casterbridge.
Yes, that's the name. He had a moustache, no whiskers or beard.
He had.
What kind of person is he?
"Oh, miss, I blush to name it, a gay man. But I know him to be very quick and trim, who might have made his thousands like a squire, such a clever young dandy as he is. He's a doctor's son by name, which is a great deal, and he's an earl's son by nature."
Which is a great deal more, I fancy. Is it true?
"Yes, and he was brought up so well, and sent to Casterbridge Grammar School for years and years, learnt all languages while he was there, and it was said that he got on so far that he could take down Chinese in shorthand, but that I don't answer for, as it was only reported. However, he wasted his gifted lot, and listed a soldier, but even then he rose to be sergeant without trying at all. Ah, such a blessing it is to be high-born. Nobility of blood will shine out even in the ranks and files. And is he really come home, miss?"
"I believe so. Good night, Liddy."
After all, how could a cheerful wearer of skirts be permanently offended with a man? There are occasions when girls like Bathsheba will put up with a great deal of unconventional behaviour, when they want to be praised, which is often, when they want to be mastered, which is sometimes, and when they want no nonsense, which is seldom. Just now the first feeling was in the ascendant with Bathsheba, with a dash of the second. Moreover, by chance or by devilry, the ministrant was antecedently made interesting by being a handsome stranger who had evidently seen better days. So she could not clearly decide whether it was her opinion that he had insulted her or not.
"Was ever anything so odd?" she at last exclaimed to herself in her own room. "And was ever anything so meanly done as what I did, to skulk away like that from a man who was only civil and kind?"
Clearly she did not think this barefaced praise of her person an insult now. It was a fatal omission of Boldwood's that he had never once told her she was beautiful. End of chapter 24.